short. So my point about this is I genuinely believe that the way to stand up for the 17.4 million is now to get to the bill. And I said to my, my honourable friend who's not here in his place from Stone, who I revere, as I said, in constitutional law, here he is. I say to my honourable friend, Bill needs to get to the bill. And the reason for that is we will then look and see what of the Attorney General's issues that he raised and how he protects us is in the bill. What can we ensure is in this bill? And we can then still make a judgment about whether this bill represents what we believe is the way in which we should leave. And I therefore say to my honourable friends, they do need to consider this immediately. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful for him giving way. On the 3rd of March, on his website, the right honourable member said British governments have lied about the EU for decades. This deal is the final deceit, and he's going to vote for it.
My simple point that I simply make to him is absolutely, this has been a trail of deceit on both sides of the House by different governments. But the judgment I'm taking today is what is that balance of risks? I believe that the one saving grace of this so far is that we do repeal the 1972 European Communities Act, and that means that we will have left the European Union. And the point I make about that is why that is a single issue that I would take. As my honourable friend, the member for Stone, said earlier on, we need to get to the bill and figure out how that is protected. Is that the default mechanism? And is the attorney's comment right that they will protect? No, I'm not giving way because others wish to speak. That the attorney's comment that that is the right place to be is the way to be. I want my government not to be deceitful and to own up as to whether or not that bill does protect those rights, and for my honourable and right honourable friends to make that judgment at that particular point when we've actually seen the bill. And I say to my honourable and right honourable friends, genuinely today, this is an opportunity for us to get this going. If we don't, we go to the 12th of the month. And what we have in that particular case is only a very simple statement that we will extend. An extension is death in terms of our voters, the people that actually put us here, that wanted us to get this through. And I only ask my honourable and right honourable friends, look around you. Here we are, we sit. Every one of the speeches made, even the interventions, is demanding that we go to the 12th because they know we will get that extension. So it's very important. We are in a chamber of people who really don't want to leave the European Union at all. And I know and honour my friends who have fought and campaigned to get this changed. But I simply say to them right now, we need to have a moment when we recognise that what we need to take hold of is that one element that gets us out, leaves us out, and then shuts down the debate about future referendums and allows us, therefore, to take the confidence that under a new leadership we can go forward to change the nature of what is in this process. I therefore say to my colleagues, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I say to my colleagues that for me this is not an easy decision, because there is a lot about this bill that I do not like, and I stand on that position. But I do say that if we don't send this forward to look at the legislation, we will rue that day, because we will end up having to accept what I think is a damaging and destructive extension, meaning we will never leave the European Union. And if we say we stand up for 17.4 million people, then we have to get those people what they asked for, is to leave the European Union, and this now is the only way.
Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what a shambles it has been, and today we see desperate measures by a desperate government. We hear the cabinet is riven. We know that members of the government party are at loggerheads with each other. And to add insult to injury, we now know that this issue, this important, hugely important constitutional issue, the biggest issue of my lifetime is now going to be the centre of a Conservative Party leadership contest. And that tells us what we need to know, that this has stopped a long time ago being anything about the referendum in 2016, anything about the British people, and it is everything about the party that purports to be our government today. And we have seen repeated mistakes. First of all, a referendum passed with no rules and no planning. Not even half a dozen civil servants in the basement of the Treasury or the Cabinet Office working out what might have happened if the vote went the way it did. And then the Prime Minister triggering Article 50 in March of 2017 in order to rush in to a process with, again, no plan. And then, recklessly, to call a general election a month later where she lost even the fig leaf of a majority. And now we see a PM incapable of negotiation over that 2-year period, a government that was secretive. And I chair the Public Accounts Committee, Mr. Speaker, and my committee has worked hard, along with other committees, to make sure to try and get information about what was happening in preparing for Brexit. Answer comes there none. I met the late head of the Cabinet Office who said it would damage our negotiation position if the government revealed this information. Information that is flowing around Brussels like no tomorrow. Information that sectors of industry and of the community know about. And I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's making a powerful and important speech. On the Environmental Audit Committee, just a week ago, we asked the DEFRA Secretary what steps he was taking in the event of a no-deal Brexit to protect British farmers. He said there was a package of funds that would be available, but that he couldn't tell us, as MPs, accountable for taxpayers' money, how and how much and where it would be spent. Does she agree with me that that is the most incredible abuse of a government's power, to commit funding to farmers and not to tell MPs about how much is going to be spent?
My honourable friend makes an important point, and my committee has repeatedly said that businesses and people need to know what's happening, and yet government was only advising businesses in October of last year about some of the preparations they would need to make for a no-deal Brexit. And we estimate huge costs, billions of pounds, which I don't have time to go into today, of the costs of business just for preparing for a potential no-deal alone. And we had this unveiling of a deal last November with none of this information, and it would have been easy and sensible and proper government to be talking to sectors about what might happen. And had the government been doing that, it might have been listening to the reality for people on the ground. And yet we are here in this desperate last-ditch attempt by the government to rescue itself and this country from a disaster of its own making. We are being asked to agree the withdrawal agreement with no guarantee about what next. The little certainty that that gives is little comfort, cold comfort for businesses out there. It is a leap of faith that we are being asked to take. But, Mr. Speaker, I have no faith in this government to deliver on this or any further stages of Brexit. We're being asked to vote for this withdrawal agreement with no knowledge of what will be in the political agreement. It is a leap into the dark, and I am not prepared to take that leap and put my constituents in that position.
Quite right.
And the Public Accounts Committee has highlighted through 10 reports the problems and challenges and the costs of preparing for no deal. And of course the civil service has had to prepare for no deal and for a deal simultaneously, double the cost. The cost is high in pounds, but it is hugely high in the confidence of this nation. This utter failure. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you for giving way. I had the honour of serving on the Public Accounts with her just when I entered into this House. She's talking about risk. Knowing what she does through the Public Accounts Committee, does she not recognise that the greatest risk is not passing this withdrawal agreement, not having that certainty on data, not having that certainty on customs, not having that certainty for the United Kingdom for their move forward? She is very right. Oh, sorry, the Honourable Lady is right. There's a big discussion to have about the future, but we've got to do this first before we get to that discussion.
Together!
The honourable gentleman served honourably on the Public Accounts Committee, and he was an assiduous member of that committee, and he knows, and I know, that, yes, we need certainty, but to jump into the dark, to pass this today without any of that detail is too much of a leap of faith. And my point is very clearly that the government could have been sharing and discussing a lot more. If we remember back to the 2017 general election, the discourse that we were having then was remarkably different to the discourse we are having 2 years later. And it is for that reason that I now think we need to have a deal that goes back to the people, because we are now 3 years on from that original referendum, and people are now seeing that there is no certainty here about what is being proposed. And this lack of certainty is hitting prices in our shops, and our consumers, our constituents are having to pay more for the basics. It's hitting businesses who are stopping me in the street to tell me about the challenges that they are facing as they prepare potentially for no deal. And the cost of preparing for that no deal is very real for them. Every time we speak about this, Mr. Speaker, the exchange rate jumps and there is uncertainty there. It is utter recklessness for a government, Her Majesty's government, to lead the country into this uncertainty. So we need to accept that we do need a longer extension in order to reach both agreement and then make sure we pass the relevant laws on whatever that agreement is. And it has often been quoted today and elsewhere that we should not be rushing into European Union elections. I say, don't let the tail wag the dog. If that's what has to happen in order to have a longer extension, then so be it. Understandably, many in this House will feel that is not ideal. And the honourable member for Esher and Walton talks about renegotiation with the European Union. He had the privilege of serving as a Secretary of State. He knows, as I know in the 3 years that I spent negotiating for the last Labour government in Europe, that you can't negotiate the changes that would need to be negotiated in the 2 weeks or even up to the 22nd of May that would need to be negotiated. We rely on working together while we are still members with the other 27 nations in the European Union, and we need to make that change. And we have been very good at this. Our diplomatic skills, the talent of our governments, of successive governments of different colours, have achieved a lot from the European Union. So it's in our power to achieve a lot, but not in 2 weeks.
Before she finishes, can I just a very quick intervention and say, would she agree with me that what is most hurtful, those of us who sit on all benches, who actually heard the voice of the people in the referendum, but are absolutely committed to get a deal that's a decent deal, a good deal for the people in our constituencies. We haven't turned our back on them, we're listening, but we want them to give them a chance to decide if the deal's good enough for them.
I completely agree, but we must, above all, rule out no deal. We have voted on that in this House, and yet it remains a risk, and no responsible government should lead us over the cliff edge and put up fig leaves. I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I certainly don't want to see us crash out with no deal either. I don't support a second referendum, but if we had one, it seems to me only fair that the people should decide on a deal or a no deal or remain.
Why? Well, we can get in. One of the realities, of course, if we were to propose and get a bill for a second referendum, is this House would have to vote on at least 5 separate occasions in order to frame that legislation. So I'm not going to talk about those hypothetical dip situations. But we need no deal to be ruled out. There is consensus here. The government needs to make that absolutely clear. Parliament is coalescing, as the indicative votes process showed, around options, which we will get the chance to vote on Monday and potentially on Wednesday. And yet the government has made no commitment that it will take any notice of that. They are not binding votes, and I hope that we'll get some comfort from the front bench today about how they will react to that. And I'll give way one last time.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. She's making a powerful speech and being very generous. Was she as dismayed as I was to hear the International Trade Secretary on the Today programme this morning saying in terms that he did not support a customs union, which is what this House will be voting on Monday if the deal falls today?
Well, of course, it's up to the government of the day to set out its position, but I would hope that at the point when we are going to be debating this again on Monday and voting as a Parliament on, and only because the government has failed so abysmally, that the government might have the the courtesy to have listening ears on and be prepared to hear what Parliament may be willing to support. But, Mr Speaker, I've said my piece. The government needs to listen, must rule out no deal. We need to make sure we are moving forward. We need a longer extension, and ultimately we will need to go back to the people, because we are now 3 years on from a referendum. Things have moved on. The public are not fools. They can see when things are not working and when this government has let them down. Mr Speaker, I rest my case.
Sir John Redwood.
Mr Speaker, I know that numerous MPs, particularly on the Conservative side of the House, are finding this a very difficult vote and a very difficult decision to make. So perhaps I could just briefly explain how I've gone about trying to reach my difficult conclusion on what I must do. And the first thing I ask myself is, what do my voters in Wokingham want me to do? Because where they have a very strong majority for a certain conclusion, I would need an extremely good reason to disagree with them. And it is quite clear from all those who have communicated with me, talked to me, sent me emails, that there is a very big majority in Wokingham against accepting this agreement. It has brought together people who both voted Remain and voted Leave, and they've all come to the same conclusion. They would like a different outcome afterwards, but they come to the same conclusion, that this is not an agreement that the United Kingdom should in any circumstances sign up to. The national polling reflects this as well, and that is why it's a matter of interest, I think, to all members in this House, that this agreement has somewhere between 15 and 25% support on a very good day in a favourable poll. So roughly 4 out of 5 people have considered it and think it is a very bad idea, and I would urge all to bear that in mind before they finally cast their vote this afternoon. The second thing I ask myself is, what have I and my party promised my electors in Wokingham and the wider electorate in the United Kingdom that we serve? And there again, it is very clear that I and the National Manifesto in 2017, which then gave me my mandate, said that we would see Brexit through, that it would take 2 years after the formal notification had been received, that no deal was better than a bad deal, that of course we would do our best to get a really good deal, which was our preference. And the manifesto of the National Conservative Party wisely said that the government would negotiate both parts together. Any withdrawal issues would be negotiated in parallel with the future trading arrangement and the future partnership. And how wise that was, because at that point the government and our leader understood that there would be compromises made, and if you were going to make concessions in the withdrawal bit, you wanted the good news in the partnership bit to be nailed down at the same time. And unfortunately, the government changed its mind about that shortly after the general election, and that has let the public down, because it means that we haven't used the purchase of all the concessions the government made in the withdrawal agreement to nail down what is needed, in their view, for the future partnership agreement. And I feel very bad about that. And I have to say to my electors that in order to get closer to what I and the government promised, I have to say no to half of the total agreement when it is so obviously weighted very strongly against the United Kingdom and against our interests. But then I come to the third thing. My electors elected me, and they elected me to exercise my judgment. They expect me to read all the documents and understand the background and study major matters for myself. And on this happy occasion, their view and my view coincide. That I have studied all the documents, I have followed very closely the negotiations, I've offered a great deal of advice to the Prime Minister and her team. Much of it, I'm afraid, has not been taken, and thus we are where we are, as the Attorney General said. But my study of the documents tells me this, that the withdrawal agreement is not leaving the European Union, that were it to pass, it will be followed by an extremely bad piece of legislation which recreates all the powers of the European Union and applies them to us for a period of between 2 and 4 years. We won't even be told for how long, because it's in the gift of the European Union and the negotiations, and that we might end up having to accept a large amount of the rules and the trading arrangements in perpetuity because of the most unfortunate Irish backstop which has been placed in, and because none of us want to break up our country. It would mean the only way we could fulfil the requirements of this solemn treaty would be for the whole United Kingdom to stay in all the arrangements that the EU demanded. And the agreement would mean that for a period of at least 2 years and maybe 4 years, the European Union could negotiate in any way it saw fit over an extremely wide range of issues, not just related to business and trade. And this House of Commons would have no voice and no vote and no right to do anything other than implement it faithfully and fully without us amending it or even complaining through a reputable mechanism. And I don't see how anyone could possibly inflict that upon a great country which has recently voted to be sovereign, to take back control. I do not see how this House could possibly vote for this agreement when it has open-ended financial commitments on an enormous scale. The Treasury has, I think, very optimistically priced them at a pretty big £39 billion. But there are no numbers in the agreement. There is no agreement about the bills that will be set. And there is a mechanism which allows the EU to send us bills under very broad headings, and then with a system of referee to try and deal with disagreements, heavily weighted in favour of the EU, with any legal matter being resolved by the European Court of Justice. Now, who on earth would agree to pay unlimited, unknown bills and not have genuinely independent arbitration over the purpose? And when will the government give us any purpose for offering to pay all this money? Because they are in this absurd position, because of the way they've handled the negotiation, that they've decided to pay the money, but they haven't secured any goods or services in return for it. Now, when I go shopping, I don't put £39 on the counter and say to the shop, that is your money, whatever happens next. Now can we, for the next 21 months, have a discussion about whether you're going to let me have anything in return for my £39. But that, unfortunately, is what we're being asked to approve in this agreement this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. So, in conclusion, for me, it turns out to be an easy decision. I'm sorry for a lot of my right honourable and honourable friends, it is not so easy. I never find it easy to vote against the government I want to support. And in this Parliament, I very rarely voted against the government I want to support. But on this one issue, I have voted against the government before, and I will vote against it again this afternoon, because this is a dreadful agreement. It is a fully binding treaty with no exit clause, something we can't get out of, and there would be requirement after requirement after requirement. We would have subcontracted our legislation to someone we can't control and we have to obey, and we'd offered them to pay them for a lot of money for no obvious good reason.
Thank you. Mr. Hilary Benn.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I will be voting against this motion today, not because I do not believe that we owe the money. I disagree with the right honourable gentleman who has just spoken. Not because I disagree that we need to protect EU and UK citizens, we need a long transition, we need an Irish backstop, but because this motion is a transparent attempt by the government to avoid another meaningful vote in the terms of Section 13(1) of the 2018 European Union Withdrawal Act, for which this House fought long and hard in the summer of 2018. Of course I'll give way.
Would the right honourable gentleman, in making his speech, give an answer as to how, compliant with the Speaker's ruling, he would have brought a vote that fulfilled the conditions he just mentioned?
I will readily give, and I shall come on to that very point later on in my speech. The government could choose, if it wished to seek to change the political declaration with the European Union. And it is the government's consistent failure to do that, because of its consistent failure to reach out across the House, that the government finds itself in the difficulty it has created today. But I shall return to that point a little later on. We cannot, Mr. Speaker, separate the withdrawal agreement from the political declaration, because both parts are essential to the process. It is like saying, right, I am selling the house I'm living in at the moment without having any idea whatsoever where we're going to live afterwards. And indeed, you would not have the withdrawal agreement without the political declaration. Article 52, that's 50 bracket 2, refers specifically, and I quote, to setting out the arrangements for its withdrawal, taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union. And as my honourable friend, the Shadow Solicitor General, in what I thought was a brilliant speech, quoted the statement of the Prime Minister on the 14th of January. And I'm just going to repeat one small bit of it. She said, "One cannot be banked," referring to the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, "without the commitments of the other." And yet what this motion before the House today seeks to do is explicitly to try and bank the commitments of one without the commitments of the other. And I do not see how that can in any way be consistent with what the Prime Minister told the House of Commons on the 14th of January. Now, the second reason why I shall vote against it is, what are the consequences of passing this motion? Because the aim, and the Attorney General was absolutely frank about it, is to gain an extension to the 22nd of May rather than the 12th of April by satisfying the requirement of Article 1 of the European Council decision of the 22nd of March, which stated, in the event that the withdrawal agreement is approved by the House of Commons by the 29th of March 2019 at the latest, the period provided for in Article 53, 50 bracket 3 of the Treaty of the European Union is extended until the 22nd of May 2019. Now, the problem, and my intervention with the Attorney General was trying to address that, is that by the time, if we did pass this motion and got that extension, we get to the week beginning the 20th of May, if at that moment we have not yet resolved the question of our future political and economic relationship, and the UK decided that it needed to apply for a further extension, I would argue that the EU is almost certain to refuse any such extension on the grounds that we have failed to take part in the European elections. And that is because of paragraph 10 of the decision of the European Council, which said, again, and I quote, "If the United Kingdom is still a member state on the 23rd to the 26th of May 2019, which we would be if we asked for and were granted an extension beyond the 22nd of May, it will be under the obligation to hold the elections to the European Parliament in accordance with Union law. It is to be noted that the United Kingdom would have to give notice of the poll by 12th of April 2019 in order to hold such elections." Well, since it would be impossible on the 20th of May to give notice to hold elections on the 23rd of May, it would be impossible to comply with this requirement. And therefore, what this motion before the House today means is that if it were carried, it would in effect rule out any possibility of a further extension under Article 50 beyond the 22nd of May. So if at that point we have not reached agreement on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, then this motion would mean the UK leaving without a deal on the 22nd of May. And the House voted this week by 400 votes to 160 to reject for the third time leaving with no deal. The only other way forward would be to revoke Article 50 to buy ourselves a little bit more time, but the Prime Minister has repeatedly told the House that she would refuse to do so. I will give way.
I'm really grateful to the Right Honourable Member. Doesn't that mean that, in fact, this motion before us should not be called the withdrawal bill proposal, but, in fact, the prevention of the right of the British people to vote in a European election bill?
That would indeed be the consequence if the motion were passed. I'll be perfectly frank with the honourable member, if there were a way round the problem of participation in the European elections, I think many people in the House would seek to find it, but it is quite clear that the European Union, in the form of the Commission and the Council and the legal advice, has said that this is not possible, and therefore, in effect, this is a no-deal motion. It is. And for that reason alone, it deserves to be defeated. Now, my last point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is this. This bill is displacement activity on the part of the government, because the government should be turning its effort and attention to the real issue, which is our future relationship. And I listened. Of course I'll give way to the minister.
I have great respect for the Right Honourable Gentleman, the work he does on the Select Committee, but he just described what we are voting on today as a no-deal motion. What we're voting on today is an agreement. It is an agreement which has been agreed by the UK and the EU, and it is an agreement that his committee will recognise provides vital protections for citizens. I think he should reconsider that argument about a no-deal motion.
Well, no, I reciprocate the respect for the Minister, who is doing a very good job, I have to say, in extremely difficult and trying circumstances. But this is half an agreement that is being... It's half an agreement that is being presented to the House. And I am saying to the government that it should be focusing all of its attention on the real problem on this side of the House, which is the content, or to be more precise, the lack of content, of the political declaration. Very briefly, and then I'm going to...
I thank my right honourable friend for making a very powerful and important speech. Does he agree with me that if the bill, the withdrawal bill, actually ends up getting put through Parliament, it's likely to be highly contentious, not least because it's going to have to reverse the previous EU Withdrawal Act in order to pass?
Well, indeed, and it's always been the case that it would have to, because of the withdrawal agreement, that it was going to have to reverse, in particular, It's the same session. Well, this is a very interesting question, but I am being diverted from the final point I wanted to make. I listened to the Attorney General's, I thought, kind reference to the indicative votes process. I almost forgot that the government voted against it happening this week. But if they were taking it seriously, then they would indicate a willingness to compromise if the House is able to find a way forward. And why has the deal been defeated twice? Because it offers no clarity and no certainty for our future. If businesses come to me in my constituency and say, Hillary, I know how it works today, I export. Tell me how it will work with this political declaration in 3, 5, 10 years' time. I have to look them in the eye and tell them the truth. I have absolutely no idea. And therefore, is it right to ask the House to take us out of the European Union on that basis, especially when a new Prime Minister may be coming? Now, on Newsnight last night, it was reported that a Cabinet Minister was asked, why is the government going ahead with this vote? And that Cabinet Minister replied, expletive deleted, I'm past caring, it's like the living dead in here. So that is the problem. I won't comment on the language, but that is the problem. That has always been the problem. No. We have a divided cabinet. We have a divided parliament. We have a divided country. People are feeling very passionate out there. But this vote isn't going to solve the problem. It isn't. Monday's votes might offer us a way forward, and I hope the House is going to seize it.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think there may be one thing which probably unites us all on many sides of the on both sides of the House for most of us, which is the utterly wearing quality of the debate on which we've been engaged for so long. And so, as a consequence, when we find ourselves being presented with an opportunity that might bring that debate to a conclusion, there's always a temptation to look at it and to think that it could be a way out. And that's particularly the case because, of course, for many of us in this House, although I accept not all, the sword of Damocles of a no-deal Brexit hangs over us. And that sword of Damocles is a matter of huge anxiety, because I happen to believe it would be catastrophic for this country. But the issue that we have to the issue that we have to consider today is whether the offer that the Attorney General and the government has made to this House goes any way to resolving this problem. And in my view, it cannot and does not. The origin of the problem lies, has been so rightly said, and here I find myself in agreement with my right honourable friend member Stone and my right honourable friend the member for Wokingham, in the fact that the government set out on an enterprise where it said that at the end this House would be able to vote not only on a withdrawal agreement but upon a future relationship. Indeed, page 39 of the Conservative Party manifesto, because I'm sometimes accused of not following it, said, "We believe it is necessary to agree the terms of our future partnership alongside our withdrawal, reaching agreement on both within the 2 years allowed by Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union." And the problems that the government has had started to multiply when it became clear that that was not happening. Whatever the motivation of different members of this House in rejecting the government's deal, the truth is that at its kernel was the fact that we did not have any ability to make that assessment. That's why the government lost twice on Section 13 motions, and in truth, I suspect, even if a Section 13 motion could be brought back, it would again be rejected for the same reasons. Now the Attorney-General and the government say to us that there's a way out of this by which we can agree the withdrawal agreement, get a technical extension, I will come back to that in a moment, to the 22nd of May, and expect in the intervening period to resolve the outstanding issues to the satisfaction of this House. Just in the last week, this current week, this House, finally in its frustration, took control of the order paper because it wanted to debate the alternatives that the government didn't want us to debate. But one thing is quite clear from that debate: the alternatives need time to agree, they need time to work up, and they need time to negotiate with our EU partners. How can that be done in the context of a technical extension that my right honourable friend the Prime Minister stated at the dispatch box would be there if we reached our agreement merely to implement it? At an earlier date, I said to my right honourable friend the Chief Whip, explaining my position that if we reached agreement in this House, even if I didn't like it, I would not seek to use the passage of the Withdrawal Agreement Act for the purpose of wrecking it. That's a self-denying ordinance on my part. But it's perfectly obvious, I'm afraid I have to say, that some of my honourable friends and other honourable members in this House have an intention to use the Withdrawal Agreement Act to wreck the passage of any agreement. And I have to say, speaking personally, that if I can't vote on a clean motion to approve a deal, I will be constrained on the passage of the EU Withdrawal Act to be much freer in my opposition. The truth is that it is, I think, most unlikely that between now and the 22nd of May we have any possibility of reaching that sort of consensus, which is why I've been of the view for some time that we ought to seek to extend Article 50 further if we couldn't come to an agreement by the 12th of April. And I believe, in just a moment, and I believe that our European Union partners have understood that and would be willing for us to do it. I give way, of course, to my honourable friend.
I thank my right honourable and learned friend. I don't say this with any sense of rancour. I say it out of frustration and concern for this country. It seems to me that the losers don't know how to lose and the winners don't know how to win. And that is why we're at this sort of juncture, which almost seems insurmountable for this House to cross.
If I may say to my honourable friend that I greatly respect him, as indeed I respect the views of all my honourable friends on this side of the House and indeed elsewhere on this matter. Compromise is a very important part of the political process. But compromise happens when people come together to accept an outcome which they are prepared to endorse and respect. And it's manifestly obvious. I only had to listen to one or two of the speeches this morning on this side of the House to see that that is not what is going to happen. There is no compromise. And there's no compromise because there's nothing to compromise on in terms of the future relationship. So there is no settled will. And therefore, this siren song that is being given to us, in which I share his desire to get this over with, but this siren song will just take us further onto the rocks. And what we are going to end up with is a situation in mid-May where we will be scrabbling around with a catastrophe of no-deal Brexit and with no ability to rectify it when currently we are in a position to do so. Some of my honourable friends on this side of the House had great courage in supporting the indicative vote process and essentially rebelling against the government's position in doing it. I just have to say to them gently that having had the courage to do that, they are now abandoning it completely for something which cannot progress the debate on how we get out of our current impasse. It just will not happen. So for those reasons, however tempting it might be, however much the calls of loyalty are made, and heaven knows I feel them keenly, however much they are made, I'm afraid I cannot vote for something which, in my judgment, is not going to deliver the benefits that are claimed. Furthermore, and here I agree with my right honourable friend, the member for Woking, not for the first and not for the last time, that our constituents, whether they voted leave or voted remain, are being delivered something which is utterly, utterly different. And the vote we take tonight, today, will determine whether we end up in chaos or not. And my judgment is that we should not be, of course I give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that if we wanted to avoid chaos, we can vote for the deal? And isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend says he's not willing to compromise, and he says other people are unwilling to compromise, and he bases his own lack of compromise on other people's unwillingness to compromise? If he's willing to compromise, he will find there are many people in this House who are willing to compromise, and that compromise is a withdrawal deal.
I'm always willing to consider compromise, but as I said before, compromise has to come from a settled intention to respect an outcome. And I have to say that there is no such settled intention. Certainly by many members on this side of the House. I mean, I listened to the speech of my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford. It was quite clear from what he said that his purpose will be to use the passage of the WAP to entirely reorder the future relationship in the way he wants. Now, I don't disagree with that. It's his right. But it highlights why separating the two is plainly, in my judgment, impossible. And yet that's what we're being asked to do. Of course I give way to my right.
I hope he's not asserting that it's wrong to want to amend a bill or to debate the bill, but that to get to the bill is of vital importance, and there's nothing sinister, surely, about that.
But the bill was intended to implement the agreement for the future relationship on which we had voted. It has now been transformed into something entirely different. A free-for-all opportunity, as I understand it, although I don't suspect the government really intends that, for MPs to pile in their ideas as to not only the future relationship, but caveats in respect of Brexit, which in my view are incompatible in many cases with the withdrawal obligations themselves. Now, we have to be clear about these things. And here I revert to being an ex-law officer. Of course there will be differences of view in this House, but we have to be honest in our purposes. And I do not intend to sell my constituents short, however tempting it might be for party political advantage. In any case, if ultimately we fail the country, then we as a party are not worth existing. And the national interest in this matter must come first.
Order. After the honourable gentleman, the member for East Antrim, who is the next honourable member to speak in this debate, the time limit on backbench speeches will be reduced to 6 minutes in an attempt to accommodate the maximum number of colleagues. Mr. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't intend to spend a long time
referring to or looking at the political and parliamentary skullduggery and chicanery that we have reached or had to go through to get this motion here today. Sufficient to say that we are breaking the legislation and ignoring the legislation that this House passed in order, on the day that we were meant to be leaving the EU, to comply with a deadline which has been imposed on us by the European Union. And I think there is a certain irony in that. As far as the withdrawal agreement is concerned and the motion before us is concerned, our position has not changed. We have sought to, over the last number of weeks, to work with the government to try and find a way of either getting legal assurances or legislative changes which would enable us to move this process on. Because, of course, we want to see a deal, because we want out of the European Union, and we want to have a clear path as to how we do that. But it has not been possible. And it has not been possible, Mr. Speaker, because the withdrawal agreement itself so ties the hands of this government that it is impossible to find a way of securing the kind of assurances which are required to, first of all, make sure that the United Kingdom is not broken up, and secondly, that we do have a clear way of ensuring that the Brexit, which many of us expected to see delivered, will be delivered. And it's our regret that that process has reached an end. In the Alice in Wonderworld land that we are now living in, the Attorney General said today that this is not a meaningful vote. Well, let me say, Mr. Speaker, this is a meaningful vote to many people who want to see the delivery of our exit from the EU. It's meaningful to the people of Northern Ireland, because if this goes through, the people of Northern Ireland will find themselves stuck with a legally binding agreement which keeps Northern Ireland and puts Northern Ireland outside the United Kingdom and could be there forever at the insistence of Brussels. And despite what and I know she was going to intervene, but she's had time and time again, but despite what the Honourable Lady for North Down has said, she tries to cover and dress up her pro-EU prejudice with a justification that this agreement has no implications for the principle of consent. Has no implications for the, and I'll give way. Yes.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, but would he accept that there are those of us who consider ourselves to be passionate unionists, who believe passionately in Northern Ireland being a fully fledged member of the United Kingdom, and who don't like this deal at all, and don't like any part of it, but feel on reflection that it is the best way to proceed in the best interests of the United Kingdom?
Can I say to the honourable member, I understand the dilemma which many of my honourable friends on the other side of the chamber are facing on this. But the dilemma for me as a unionist is that I cannot, and we as a party cannot, put our hand to an agreement which would have Northern Ireland treated differently, which could have that difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom imposed on us forever by the EU, and which breaches the principle of consent in the Belfast Agreement, because it would change irrevocably the constitutional position of Northern Ireland, where we would have our laws made in Brussels instead of London. And I'll give way. Yes.
I thank very much the honourable gentleman giving way. Does he agree with me that having absolutely nothing changed about the backstop since it was first introduced, that the people of Northern Ireland, the pro-union people of Northern Ireland, whatever way they voted, remain or leave, will see anyone who voted today for this agreement today, whether they mean it or not, it will be seen as not supporting the right of people in Northern Ireland to be part of the United Kingdom?
Well, and that's the judgment. That's the judgment which we have made. And for us who have gone through a terrorist campaign of 40 years to try and remove us from the United Kingdom. We are not prepared to see our constitutional position being altered by Brussels in a fit of pique against the United Kingdom for daring to leave the EU. Let me just make a second point here. And the second reason why I will be opposing this agreement is because I believe it betrays the wishes of the vast majority of people who voted to leave the EU. And I know that the Honourable Lady for Edinburgh South, who is not in her place, has described those who voted to leave and who are standing outside today protesting as a mob. And that's a kind of disdain. That's the kind of disdain which those who have voted to leave have been, and they're being treated disdainfully in this particular withdrawal agreement. I'll give way. Yes.
Does my honourable friend also agree that if we vote for this deal tonight or this afternoon, we will be, for the first time in almost 300 years of our constitutional history, be drawing a line between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom? It may only be a trade barrier, but that's how these things start, and that will be under the direct control, in many respects, of the EU.
And of course, whether it's just a line down the Irish Sea, as described by some people, it will have serious implications for the economy of Northern Ireland. We don't even know, and we were told that even when the bill goes through, we'll still not even know the nature of those barriers, not until SIs are presented to this House or ministers use their Henry VIII powers will we know the kind of restrictions that there would be damaging the Northern. No, I'm not going to give way any more of a few Minister Manning. The third reason why I'll be voting against this is because one of the fundamental reasons that we were opposed to this is that it leaves us in a situation where we will be part of the EU without having any say, subject to EU rules during the implementation period and any extension, subject to the European Court of Justice, and only have the ability to break out of it if and when the EU decide they have screwed as much out of us in negotiations as they possibly can. And that is not the kind of agreement that I believe anyone should sign on. There's only one thing, Mr. Speaker, that has changed, and it's this: that the Irish Government and the EU this week have let the cat out of the bag. The premise on which the withdrawal agreement is based, namely that there would be a hard border down between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and that somehow would give targets for terrorists to hit and would break the peace in Northern Ireland. We have been told that in the event of a no deal, and even in their written preparations, in their legislation, the Irish Government has said that no such thing will happen. We have argued that all along. We have argued that this agreement is based on a contract. And why would we vote today for a contract which breaks up the United Kingdom, which ties us into an arrangement with the EU that we can't get out of without their assent, which is going to be the basis for any future trade relationships that we have with them? Because the EU have made it quite clear the agreement will be the basis of any future relationships. So we go in handcuffed into any negotiations. And I don't believe that that's an agreement which is worth voting for. We voted against it the first time, we voted against it the second time, and we will vote against it this time. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, what the outcome of this vote will be today. But can I assure the House that whatever means there are available to us should this agreement go through, we will continue to oppose it, because we will not allow Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland's economy, and the will of the people of the United Kingdom as a whole to become the plaything in the hands of bureaucrats from Brussels.
Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, I draw the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests, and it is a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman for Antrim East, who I first met more than 25 years ago when he was the Mayor of Belfast. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak up today for compromise, and I find myself very much drawn to the arguments put by my right honourable friend from Chingford. I was, of course, his whip more than a quarter of a century ago during the Maastricht debates, and today we are in absolute agreement, and I think he spoke extremely well in the cause of compromise. And, Mr. Speaker, I voted against the Prime Minister's deal in January. I voted against it then because I thought that there was time for the overall deal to be changed in the best interests of those I represent in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield. I voted for it, however, earlier this month because I thought the options and the opportunities have narrowed significantly, and I will be voting for it today. I don't like the deal. I've concluded it's the least worst option. I'm particularly worried about the issue of the backstop, but above all I'm worried about the central point that was made by my right honourable friend for Wokingham, which is that we have gone about this and breached the fundamental rule that was certainly the case when I used to go to ministerial meetings in Brussels, which is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And it is the failure to endorse that cardinal principle of negotiating with the EU which has let us down so badly. So, Mr. Speaker, the government has found a way to keep themselves compliant with your directions from the chair, but we're negotiating today, we're discussing and voting today on essentially the government's deal. I will vote for it. If it goes down tonight and the government fails, then this House must accept that we are back fair and square in the process set out by my right honourable friend for West Dorset, which I supported, and where it was no surprise at all, Mr. Speaker, that the House did not make a decision on Wednesday this week and voted no effectively for everything. But next Monday, Mr. Speaker, if the government fails today, then the House must recognise that those votes on Monday are extremely important, and in my judgment it is likely that the House will vote yes to at least two of them. I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He's making an important point on that. Was he not also, though, in some way inspired by the process of a couple of days ago, that on Monday we do have an opportunity to actually vote for something where there could be a majority, and in fact just 2 days ago, on 3 options, achieved more votes than actually the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement in 2 previous votes?
Well, he makes an interesting point in his own way, but the point that I am making is that on Monday the House will need to choose. If the government cannot do it, then the House must do it, and we must remember that in spite of some of the things that are said, including from the government bench, the government is accountable to Parliament and not the other way round. And on Monday, as I say, no 2 colleagues agree entirely in what they say in this House, but there will be a result, in my view. I'm so sorry, I haven't got the time to give way. There will be a result on Monday, in my view, and the government must honour that. And I hope very much that the Prime Minister will agree that members of the Cabinet, all ministers, are able to vote in this on Monday. Otherwise, members of Parliament, senior members of Parliament, will be disenfranchised from this process. There should not be a whip. If we come to this on Monday, it is a House of Commons occasion. The House of Commons must seek to sort it out. Now, Mr. Speaker, the final point I want to make is this. I think, for me, I find myself in a minority in the House of Commons. I think the House of Commons overstates the dangers of no deal. I don't believe there is such a thing as no deal. I think were we to leave with what is called no deal, there will be a whole series of smaller deals, some of them temporary, some of them more permanent, and some stops. So I do not worry as much as many of my colleagues do about the dangers of no deal. But equally, I think the House massively underestimates the dangers of advancing towards a second referendum. The anger, irritation and annoyance of our constituents will be palpable, and in my judgment it is very likely, Mr. Speaker, to solve nothing at all. Because imagine the nightmare that the country reversed the earlier vote and voted 48-52 to remain. What would that mean for our democracy? What would that mean for the votes of the people in both those referenda? So I think that to advance, for this House to advance down the route of another referendum would, in my view, be a very serious mistake at all. But it is, however, if the House of Commons cannot, the government cannot do a deal that the House of Commons will accept, if the House of Commons cannot come to an agreement in the way that I have described, then it is the ineluctable logic of that position that it will have to be referred again to the British people, and in my view that would be an absolute disaster, Mr. Speaker. So I end on this point, Mr. Speaker. This is an important negotiation, and I think that we have been outmanoeuvred as a country by the European Commission and by the 27 standing absolutely firm, as they said they would, and which many of us did not believe. But this is an important negotiation. They have interests and we have interests. And in my judgment, unless the European Union and the Commission are able to show a little bit more of a sense of compromise to what the government has been saying, then it will leave a profound legacy of bitterness across the channel between the European Union and this country. They are our friends and our partners. We are going to trade with them, do business with them and work with them over the coming years and the coming generations. We have huge security interests as well, which bind us together. And I hope obviously that the government is successful today, but if it is not successful and we move into these further processes and the unknown, the Commission will bear in mind their interests as well in trying to reach a deal that is a good deal for both parties and is not imposed on one of those parties.
Mr. Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to be called in this important debate. And let me just say at the very start, I will do this afternoon what's in the best interests of the country and what's in the best interests of my constituents by not supporting this deal. And I just have to say at the start, I was very disappointed by the leader of the SNP's contribution to this debate. We agree on 95% of everything in this particular EU debate, and to attack the Labour Party perhaps just shows where their thought processes are at the moment, rather than trying to attack the government for the deal that they've got in front of us. Let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, that the House voted for this process against the government's wishes. And one thing we can all say with great certainty is since mid-November last year, nothing has changed. Neither has it changed in this withdrawal agreement, nor has it changed in the political declaration. The only thing that has changed is the Attorney-General's legal advice. And if you ask a lawyer the conclusion that you want and pay that lawyer for that conclusion, you're likely to get the conclusion that you're looking for. There is no trust in this place with the government. We have tried to do everything we can as a Parliament and had to drag the government through hedges to get to a place whereby we can even have this proper debate. And today, of course, I won't give way because it would mean my colleagues in the backbenches won't get a chance to speak. Today is the 29th of March, the day that we should have left the European Union. So it would be a good day to look at the government and the Leave campaign's report card on where we should have been at today's date. So, where is the extra £350 million Brexit bonanza for our NHS? It is not there. Where is the easiest trade deal in history? Not only is it not the easiest trade deal in history, but the government are having to take it out of this particular debate to get their deal through. Where is taking back control, when indeed we are ceding control? Where is the no border on the island of Ireland, when it's the solution can't be found by the government because of the red lines they set themselves? Where are the 40 bilateral trade deals that we would just have rolled over by midnight tonight? Where is the cap and the reduction in net migration? It can't be met. Where is more money going into our public services when £4.2 billion is being spent on no deal? These aren't just broken promises, Mr. Speaker, they also broke the law. There is no sunny uplands in this process, and today we should all say loud and clear that we're slaying the unicorns once and for all. This is not meaningful vote 3, this is meaningful vote 2.5. The government aren't complying with their own legislation, and they know it. And my honourable friend from Leeds Central was absolutely right. There is nothing wrong with selling your house. but you have to know where you're going to go next, and the government are asking us to sell the House without knowing where we go next. And it's not just not knowing where we go next with the political declaration, we don't know who will even be doing that negotiation. This is a blind Brexit with a blind Prime Minister and a blind government. And my honourable friend, who made a wonderful speech from the front bench, the Shadow Attorney-General, was absolutely correct that this entire debate about a future relationship with the European Union will be conducted by a Conservative leadership election that could provide a Prime Minister that will rip up the political declaration and take us to territory that we do not want to be taken into. And what happens if this motion does pass today, but then the political declaration doesn't pass, or indeed the implementation bill doesn't pass? My honourable friend from Leeds Central was absolutely correct. We end up in a situation again come the 22nd of May where it is the Prime Minister's deal or no deal, with no opportunity to extend the process. The Prime Minister in this whole process is indeed the shopkeeper in the Monty Python sketch of the dead Norwegian parrot, and this Parliament is Mr Praline, because it's quite clear that her deal is no more. It has ceased to exist. It is bereft of life. It rests in peace. It's a deal that's being nailed to its perch. It's an ex-parrot. It is an ex-deal. And interestingly, at the end of that particular sketch, the shopkeeper says, "This is getting silly," and the sketch gives up. Prime Minister and Government, this is getting silly. Give up and listen to this House. Very good. We may, Mr Speaker, end up having to revoke Article 50 come the 22nd of May if we pass this and we have no opportunity to do anything else. I suggest what the government should do now is listen to the indicative vote process that happened on Wednesday and act with dignity and respect to this House with the indicative vote processes next week, and listen to what the public are also saying. Let's have a confirmatory vote. It is completely unfair that the Prime Minister can keep flogging the dead horse of her deal in this House as many times as she likes, but the public 3 years ago got one chance on all of these sunny uplands and broken promises that they were given in 2016. Let's get a confirmatory vote back to the people, let them back into this process, let them break the impasse in this Parliament, and if they so wish to continue to leave the European Union, and the Government and the Prime Minister is so confident in her deal, she will be confident of going to the British people and getting them to back it. And if they don't, we can maintain the best deal that we have at the moment, which is the deal as a fully fledged member of the European Union.
Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This debate is quite extraordinary today, and there is no doubt about it. The British people feel anger and resentment and a great deal of disappointment towards this House and politicians over Brexit. They expected us to be leaving the EU today. But I think we don't need to go over the old ground that has already been articulated as to why we've had postponement and delay through registrations and SIs through this House. And I'm afraid, Mr Speaker, this motion today is yet another disappointment to everyone who voted to leave the EU. This motion, of course, follows a demand from the European Union made through the European Council decision of March the 22nd to agree to extend the period under Article 50. Under the provisions of that decision, the UK will be bound into staying into the EU until May the 22nd, if the motion is agreed. But of course, by agreeing to the motion, it also means accepting the withdrawal agreement as is fully drafted. And paragraph 11 of the preamble of that decision makes it clear that by agreeing to this motion, the withdrawal agreement as drafted will be locked in with no change possible. It is clear it binds the United Kingdom into accepting the withdrawal agreement and states that it excludes any reopening of the withdrawal agreement. Any unilateral commitment, statement or other by act of the United Kingdom should be comparable with the letter and the spirit of the withdrawal agreement. Yes, I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way and commend her for her stance that she has taken so far. Can I just say very gently to the Honourable Lady and to the House in particular and to the Government as well, we have been consistent. This party has been consistent in our stance for the last 2 years. It's a legally binding, time-limited backstop. That's what we've always asked for. It hasn't changed. We haven't deviated. My honourable friend for East Antrim has referred to that. Does the Honourable Lady also hold to that stance?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend's intervention, and of course the purpose of this motion and also the debate that we are having today and the comments that he's just made and I've been making is that it means that once this withdrawal agreement is agreed, there is no turning back, as the UK will be bound into an international agreement with the EU, which means, as my honourable friends and many other honourable and right honourable members know, no chance to change the withdrawal agreement, no chance to change the Northern Ireland backstop, no chance to put safeguards in place to protect our democracy from the harmful laws that will be imposed upon us, no chance to freely negotiate new trade deals with the rest of the world, and no chance to change in any meaningful way the legislation coming forward to implement the withdrawal agreement. Seeking to amend and change the legislation would risk the UK being in breach of its international obligations. Agreeing the motion will mean we face a Brexit deal that is dreamed up, drafted and decided by the EU. Once the motion is passed, we will be forced to comply with the EU's demand. That is not what we voted for. That is not what the country voted for when 17.4 million people voted to leave the EU in the greatest show of democracy this country has seen. But once again, we will see the EU's will is being imposed on the British people. And of course, the withdrawal agreement represents a legally binding treaty which will deny the British people and our Parliament the sovereign right to choose our future and be in control of our destiny. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, when I was elected to the House of Commons with a mandate to deliver Brexit, and the withdrawal agreement, of course, does not give the country the freedoms, independence and the democracy and control that people voted for. And it's becoming increasingly clear that MPs voted on those mandates to take Britain out of the EU, the customs union, are effectively, and I think we've got to be honest here now, going back on the pledges to impose a customs union on this country. The withdrawal agreement already includes a single customs territory, which forms a customs union, and many MPs, of course, we know in this House want to go further. This whole thing would prevent Britain from negotiating its own trade deals with the rest of the world and effectively keep the United Kingdom, Britain, as a rule taker. I will give way.
So agree with me, but since that time, since the referendum, we've had a general election where the Labour Party and the Conservative Party both said that in their manifestos that they would deliver on what the people voted for. And the customs union simply is not that.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, but there is something else, of course. I think people in the House now have to ask themselves whether or not they have faith in our democracy and also in the ability to govern ourselves. And as a fact of the matter is, we all should be, and rightly doing every possible, to actually keep that referendum mandate and keep us, basically, sticking to those fundamental commitments that brought every single Member of Parliament to this place here today, and the very clear commitments, because Members of Parliament who are committed to keeping our promises to the people are now being forced to make choices, hard and difficult choices, between the risk of this motion, taking a risk with this motion, or the risk of giving other supporters in this House who simply don't want to deliver Brexit or deliver those commitments that we stood on to get us here in the first place. And it is supporters in this House of Commons who we know will look to sabotage Brexit. And that is a problem that we all face and we are all confronted with right now. And it is a difficult challenge and a difficult problem. So, Mr. Speaker, to conclude, I do not take the decision that I'm going to take today in terms of how I vote following this debate at all lightly. There is grave disappointment, and nothing upsets me more today than being here, listening to the debate, and also listening to Members of Parliament who want to renege on the very commitments that brought them here. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, I will be judged on the choice that I make and the decisions that I make today, and rightly so, by the people of the Whittam constituency, the constituency that voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union. And Mr. Speaker, if I may say so, leave means leave. And I think that is exactly what the British public voted for today. They didn't vote for motion after motion coming forward in this House. They didn't vote for Members of Parliament to effectively come here, say one thing to their electorate and do something else in this House today. Individual Members of Parliament will have to make their own judgment today and not listen to what will be, what ifs, the buts and everything else. It is, as so many colleagues have said today, it is a balance of risk and probabilities. We all know this. But ultimately, Mr. Speaker,
we, as all members of Parliament, should be judged on how we vote today by the very constituents who elected us today. And finally, is it any wonder that trust in British politics is broken when we listen to some of the most extraordinary contributions, and rightly so, Mr. Speaker, but ultimately, you know, the fact of the matter is, as we've heard today, many of the pledges that we've made to our electorate are now being moved away from.
House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is a sad day, not because we should have left the EU but haven't, but because today signifies the pinnacle of a process in which a government has for months refused to respect and listen to Parliament. We live in a parliamentary democracy. The sovereignty of our Parliament is a cornerstone of our democracy. And today, MPs are being handcuffed, blindfolded and threatened to approve a deal that it has overwhelmingly refused twice. If anything signifies the death of our democracy, which is a parliamentary democracy, it would be that. This is a desperate last attempt of a government and a Prime Minister who has lost control, and for anybody who is a passionate supporter of democracy, Parliament and sovereignty, this, to me, is an outrage. And for that reason alone, MPs should vote against today's motion, an attempt of an arrogant government which has attempted to bamboozle, arm twist and vilify the very representatives of the will of the people. The government has not just lost trust, but the last morsel of goodwill, and I wonder what way that is to get consent. And who buys the argument that voting for today's motion will provide certainty? It will do nothing of the sort. I'm happy to give way.
For giving way, will she just make it absolutely clear whether she and the Liberal Democrats want to honour the result of the referendum and leave the European Union, or whether they want to frustrate the will of the people and keep us locked into it?
I thank him for that contribution and the opportunity to say again and again, if it was 100% clear that 17.4 million people voted to leave without a deal, or indeed it was absolutely 100% clear that 17.4 people voted for the Prime Minister's deal, which is what you should actually discuss with your own Prime Minister, then I could agree with it. But we don't know that, which is exactly why we need to test the will of the people. It was not clear, and I'm happy to give way.
Does the young lady find it somewhat ironic that there are those opposite who are changing their mind on how they're going to vote, and indeed have already changed their vote in relation to the Withdrawal Act, but for some reason they won't allow the British people the opportunity to change their mind and to change their vote?
I couldn't agree more, and it is really ultimately the arrogance of individual members who proclaim that they know exactly the will of the people. I don't know the will of the people 2019. I'm happy to ask them.
Grateful to the honourable member for giving way. I understand that I understand, Mr. Speaker, that she is making the argument eloquently that people didn't necessarily vote for a tick box of what sort of leave they would want. But does she accept the basic principle that 17.4 million people voted to leave, and the best way that we can leave in an orderly way is to vote for the deal? Thank you.
I absolutely agree with the principle that 17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union, which is exactly why the most democratic way of going forward is to ask the people in 2019, once we know what the choices are. And the real lie of the Believe campaign to me was that it was not a clear choice. That is what was the betrayal to the people. Now in 2019, if we had a referendum, we would give people a clear choice between a Brexit deal, and I don't mind which one that is, and staying in the European Union, which would be a much more honest referendum this time round, but I need to get on. There is actually, and we are coming to that, a very easy way of this government to get a deal through, to agree to put it to the people. The government has unfortunately made its position clear. It doesn't support a people's vote. But the great strength of the indicative vote process two days ago is that it could test a sentiment in the House and had started of combining choices. Combining choices is how the indicative vote process can move forward towards a majority view. Not all choices can be combined. We cannot combine leaving the EU with not leaving the EU. But we can combine leaving the EU with a people's vote. The indicative vote on Tuesday, a people's vote, achieves the highest numbers of votes. So the question for today is why the Prime Minister doesn't offer a people's vote on her deal to get it over the line. I have a strong suspicion that if the House was to vote for a combined motion to vote for the Prime Minister's deal subject to a people's vote, the Prime Minister would vote against her own deal. We keep coming back, and we've done that, to the question of our democracy. I and many others in this House have pointed out that democracy didn't end in 2016. It is now over 2.5 years since that date, and it is increasingly absurd for members to argue for implementing the will of the people in 2016 while simultaneously refusing to ask the people what they think in 2019. And absolutely, if we have the right to change our mind, why do we not give that democratic right to the people of this country? And I say to the Prime Minister, you can get your deal over the line by combining it with a people's vote, and I hope very much that moving on into next week's indicative votes, we can all agree to combine some of our options as a compromise. But the ultimate thing has to be, if we are doing that here, if we are changing things, that change needs to be put back to the people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Dominic Raab.
Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, even though I take a fairly fundamentally different view from her. Mr. Speaker, last November I resigned from the Cabinet because I couldn't support the government's Brexit deal, and I would tell the House I still believe it to be a bad deal. I also recognise that with the government purporting to take no deal off the table and its acquiescence in the extension of Article 50, that we potentially now face an even worse alternative that could reverse Brexit and betray our democracy. In extending Article 50 and signalling that it was taking WTO exit off the table, the government rather weakened its own negotiating position in Brussels, and I'm afraid it heartened some of those here in Parliament who are seeking to frustrate Brexit. I believe that decision, which was a choice, was a mistake, and as a direct result of that political choice, we now face a very real risk of the UK being forced to accept something akin to single market membership, losing control over our laws, our borders, and an independent trade policy. I'll make just a little progress. The course the government has taken gives rise to the very real concern that it would acquiesce in a further long extension, which on both sides of the Channel would be used to try and exhaust the UK into revoking Brexit altogether. That is something that I believe we must not entertain nor allow. In fairness to the government, I also recognise that they have provided some additional assurances at the domestic level that Northern Ireland will not be forced alone to follow EU regulations. That is of some value, although I well appreciate the concerns of those, not just on that side of the House, who are concerned that those assurances are not contained within the withdrawal agreement and therefore are not binding at the international level. And until we see the bill, it is impossible to assess the strength of those safeguards. Mr. Speaker, beyond those assurances, the unilateral declaration, the joint instrument relating to the exit from the so-called backstop, do not change our international obligations, and frankly they offer scant political comfort either. In all of this, however frustrating, I believe we need to proceed with some realism. The choice now is between the risk of being held in the backstop by the EU for a period without being able to control our exit, and on the other hand, a significant risk of losing Brexit altogether. Neither are palatable. Both could have been avoided if the government had shown the requisite resolve and will. And I appreciate that for many colleagues, this presents a very finely balanced judgment call. I share the deep frustrations many feel at being presented with two such unsavoury alternatives. And Mr. Speaker, anger is not a political strategy. And in this fast-moving and fluid landscape, I believe we must assess the specific and tangible decision before us at this point in time. The motion today explicitly does not satisfy Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act, so it is not in practice or in law a third meaningful vote. However, and I think the right honourable gentleman, the member for Leeds Central, made this point rather well. However, the vote on its own terms does have significant legal and practical implications. First, it is necessary to satisfy the EU Council decision on the 22nd of March to avoid and indeed prevent the government from returning to the EU to seek an even longer extension. I regard that as essential. The second implication of the motion, by virtue of that, is to avoid the UK holding European elections in May, and I regard that as absolutely essential to avoid the very dangerous and corrosive effect on public trust in our democracy. I give way to my...
May I urge my right honourable friend to think again before deciding to change his mind and support what is, in all intents and purposes, a meaningful vote 3. We don't know what the future holds for sure, but what we do know for sure is that we can only decide on those facts that are before us, and we know this is a bad deal that could lock the UK indefinitely in a backstop for a very long time. When deciding to vote against Iraq, and like many others in this place, we could only judge it on the facts at the time, not about threats about WMD. Please consider that before he finally makes his mind up.
Always listen very attentively to my honourable friend. He posits the dilemma, I think, absolutely correctly, and this is a finely balanced judgment of risk. The problem I have is that I cannot countenance an even longer extension, and I cannot countenance holding European elections in May. And the third implication is that a duly constituted third meaningful vote under Section 13 will have to return to this House for a vote, presumably under second reading vote on the Withdrawal and Implementation Bill. That will buy the government a little more time and a little more room for manoeuvre. In my view, the government should use that time to revert to the EU and seek an exchange of letters that can provide the legally binding changes to give effect to the Brady Amendment. Well, I hear some honourable members on that side looking in rather disbelief, and I listened very carefully to the honourable lady when she spoke to this. Why is it that the EU's position is treated as immutable and unmovable, but the UK is always expected? And I say to the House, I won't because of the time, and I say to the House that it is succumbing to that mindset, which is precisely what led us to this predicament in the first place. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, the risk of a WTO departure is growing because of the position of the EU as well as what we do in this House. And I believe that with the EU, not just on aviation, not just on lorries, where progress has been made, we should continue to collaborate to mitigate the risk to jobs, to livelihoods, to businesses which arise on both sides. That is the responsible thing for all sides to do, and I hope that the government is engaged in that. Of course, if the EU itself rejects all of these offers and overtures, it must take its responsibility for the consequences of its political intransigence in what follows. On that basis, Mr. Speaker, I will vote for the motion. I will do so without prejudice to my position on the Section 13 meaningful vote to achieve two essential outcomes: stave off a longer extension and prevent European elections in May, and I hope the government can more vigorously pursue the reassurance we need on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration to make the deal more acceptable to this House.
Liz Kendall.
Mr. Speaker, I will be voting against the withdrawal agreement tonight because it's not what people were promised. It will lead to a worse deal than we have now, and far from sorting Brexit, the uncertainty facing our country will go on for years to come. Now, I know that many people, including those who aspire to be the next Prime Minister of this country, want to sweep the promises they made during the referendum under the carpet, say they are somehow not relevant, or hope that people will forget. But members on this side of the House, remember that our constituents were promised when we leave we'll hold all the cards, that agreeing our entire future relationship with the EU would be the easiest in human history, and that we would have the exact same benefits as now. Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. But I am acutely aware that despite this, many people say to me, we just want Brexit to be sorted, we want it to be over. They're fed up with all the incomprehensible twists and turns, all the arguments and anger, and they want us to get on with it. They want us to deal with the issues that matter in their daily lives. But we have to speak the truth, that this withdrawal agreement and political declaration, which cannot be separated, solve none of the fundamental questions we face about the future relationship with the EU and the huge consequences this will have for jobs, businesses and public services. And, Mr. Speaker, if we don't get those choices right, it will mean dealing with issues like housing. The future of our public services will be even harder, if not impossible, to achieve. And the grim truth is that if this withdrawal agreement gets through today, we will be taking a huge leap into the unknown. Worse still, none of the fundamental questions and choices will be made by members on this side of the House. They will be made by the winner of the next Tory leadership election. And, Mr. Speaker, I have looked on in what I can only describe as growing disgust as certain members of the Tory party, who for months have opposed the withdrawal agreement, now flipping to support it. Not out of any principle, but purely for their own personal political gain. Mr. Speaker, no. Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow the future of this country to be held to ransom by the never-ending internal Tory psychodrama and people who want to put their own jobs and ambitions before the jobs and ambitions of people in this country. Mr. Speaker, in my closing comments, I want to touch on something that may not be the main focus of today's debate. But just as with the financial crash, I fear that Brexit and the subsequent political crisis we've had will have long-term consequences for both main political parties, for faith in our parliamentary democracy and the political process, for our sense of nationhood and national identity, and for Britain's standing in the eyes of other countries throughout the world. But we will not deal with any of these problems and challenges by voting for the withdrawal agreement and just hoping they'll go away, or by putting the future of this country into the hands of a hardline Tory Brexiteer who will never be satisfied until their ideological purity has been achieved at the expense of everyone in this country except themselves. We will only deal with these issues and challenges by facing them head-on. We need, Mr. Speaker, a longer extension so we can build a lasting consensus about the best way forward, not just within this House, but crucially with the British people. And I hope all honourable members on this side of the House, for this reason, will join me by voting against the withdrawal agreement tonight.
Sir Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, I shall be joining the honourable lady in voting against this agreement tonight. I must say that despite the best interests of so many of my colleagues, I fear that they are falling for the siren song of the government, which is threatening no Brexit or an even softer Brexit as the only alternatives to voting for the agreement today. But do my right honourable friends not realise that if the agreement were to be approved today, they will be powerless to prevent the ensuing legislation being amended to keep the United Kingdom in the single market, in the customs union, and indeed without our ability to control immigration. we will have given up £39 billion and our unilateral right to leave the European Union, and we were being held to ransom by those people in this House who do not wish to honour the Conservative Party manifesto, or for that matter the Labour Party manifesto, both of which manifestos were committed to implementing the will of the people as enunciated in the referendum. So I must say I associate myself absolutely with the words of wisdom from my right honourable friend the member for Wokingham, the honourable gentleman the member for East Antrim, and also my right honourable friend for Witham. I think that they sum up accurately my mood. The Attorney-General sought to make a virtue of a new legal right to stay in the European Union until the 22nd of May. Mr. Speaker, I'm more concerned to enforce and deliver our existing legal right to leave on the 12th of April. Leaving on the 12th of April, although 2 weeks later than we hoped, will, on WTO terms, will bring certainty. Those 2 weeks can be used to further reduce the short-term problems. And let's also remember that in the indicative votes, the overwhelming majority of the Conservative Party in the Parliament voted in favour of the no-deal option. And let's not forget that. And we know also from what my right honourable friend for Wokingham was saying that there's very little support for the Prime Minister's deal across the country, and indeed there is growing support and much greater support for the no-deal WTO outcome. So I think we should be listening to those people, and we should be expecting more support for the no-deal option, which of course remains the default option. If we vote against this agreement this evening, then we will be leaving on the 12th of April, as indeed we could have been leaving today had it not been for the way in which the Prime Minister unilaterally decided to stand up against the will of the people. Some of my right honourable and honourable friends are holding their noses for this, for a withdrawal agreement that they despise. Why would you want to hold your nose and vote for something that was so much against your own instincts and against the interests of the British people? Mr. Speaker, I fear that in having this debate today, on the basis of the European Council decision on the 22nd of March, to provide an extension to Article 50 to the 12th of April, but to the 22nd of May if we approve the withdrawal agreement, that our European colleagues were rather misled into thinking that the reference there to the withdrawal agreement included a reference to the political declaration. Because, Mr. Speaker, if one looks at the letter sent by the Prime Minister to Donald Tusk on the 20th of March, not that long ago, she asserted the United Kingdom's policy remains to leave the European Union on the basis of the withdrawal agreement and political declaration agreed in November. Yet there seems to be a clear indication from the front bench that there's now they're minded to change the content of the political declaration through further negotiation. In that letter, the Prime Minister also said that the House of Commons had rejected the deal for a second time, and she had said that she had intended to bring the vote back in the week to the 20th of March, but that hadn't been possible because of your rulings, Mr. Speaker. And she said, in respect of those rulings, some members of Parliament have interpreted that this means a further change to the deal is necessary, implying that she perhaps was distancing herself from that interpretation. But then she said, it remains my intention to bring the deal back to the House. Not part of the deal, the deal. And then she went on to say that I intend to put forward a motion as soon as possible under Section 13 and make the argument for the withdrawal and so on. So she hasn't come back with the deal. She hasn't put forward a motion under Section 13. So I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that our European friends may find that when they look at the detail of this, that they've been rather gravely misled into actually the Council decision that they made. We know that they are very angry at the way in which the Prime Minister negotiated the deal, which she then sought to renege on by, for example, supporting the Brady Amendment. So I'm sure that what has been going on, and we'll get more of it next week perhaps when we've defeated this motion tonight, but I suspect suspect the Prime Minister now really needs to concentrate on delivering the will of the British people and allowing no deal on the 12th of April to proceed.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Christchurch. I don't agree with much of what he says, but I will say this in his favour. At least he's consistent with the arguments that he has made repeatedly in this place as to why he believes this is a bad deal and why he and I will be in the same lobby tonight, perhaps for some different reasons, but at least he, as I say, has been consistent, and indeed much of what he says about this deal I do agree with him for, and apparently now honourable members now decry that. It is quite bizarre, Mr. Speaker, and forgive me, I'm repeating comments that I made only a few days ago, that honourable members think it is entirely proper and indeed honourable that they should be allowed to change their vote and to change their minds, but they deny the British people exactly the same right on this matter of Brexit. And I the honourable gentleman for Spalding and the Deepest is one such right honourable member who voted against the Prime Minister's deal but now has voted for it, and again he's going to go and vote for it tonight. Mr. Speaker, in all the shameful shenanigans that have embraced Brexit, I think we've sunk to real depths, if I may say, today. And I want to explain why that is. It really isn't good enough for people to stand up and say, as we have heard, that they are now going to vote for the deal, not because they think that it might actually be rather good for our country or rather good for our constituents, but because it will stop... I see, Mr. Speaker, I've got your note. I've got 4 minutes, but he's not listening, and I shall carry on. I will take an intervention, but not yet, because I want to make this point. To say that you're going to now back the deal because it will stop an extension, even though the government's made it very clear that no more further extensions would be allowed, is, if I may say, perverse. To say you're now going to vote for the deal because it stops the European parliamentary elections, these aren't good reasons. Other honourable members opposite have said they'll vote for the Prime Minister's deal on the basis that the Prime Minister will stand down. That isn't acting with honour, that isn't acting with principle. And whilst I will be voting with the Right Honourable Lady, my friend, as she remains and always will, for Witham, at least she has been true to her principles, and she stands and she says she will not vote for this deal, and she says quite rightly she'll be held to account by her constituents, and I congratulate her for that. We don't always agree, and we don't agree on this, but on many points we do agree as to why this withdrawal agreement is bad for our country. And I pay tribute to the DUP. Mr. Speaker, as individuals, the honourable gentleman at the front decries that. He hasn't even let me finish my sentence. As a grouping, I have grave difficulties. As individuals, I find most of them pleasant. But at least the right honourable members who sit here have been consistent, and on this I absolutely agree with them. This withdrawal agreement is a genuine threat to the union of the United Kingdom. I genuinely do believe that. It's one of the reasons why I am in fear of this agreement. I believe it is a threat to Northern Ireland and its relationship as part of our United Kingdom. I believe the same is true in Scotland. I believe that Brexit will actually increase the desire of the Scottish people to break away from the Union and strike out by themselves, because they will see a future as a member of the European Union being denied because of Brexit as a member of the United Kingdom, and in Wales too, where we know that the number of Remain voters continues now to grow. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the comments of the Right Honourable Learned Gentleman for Beaconsfield, Leicester West, the Honourable Lady, and indeed for Leeds East, when they talk about how this particular motion will actually make the certainty that British businesses are crying out for even less achievable because of the division between the political declaration and the withdrawal agreement. And it is so regrettable, given that we've started finally on a process of indicative vote, something that, as you know, many of us, Mr. Speaker, were crying out for at the beginning of this process, to bring unity, to bring the 48, the 52% together to form a consensus. But we are beginning, we've begun that process, and we are making good progress in it, and I think there will be some good reasonable outcomes which will heal the divide and take us forward in the way that we need to. But, Mr. Speaker, I finish by saying this. What sort of country have we become post the referendum? Are we a better country? Are we a happier country? Are we a more united country? Or is the absolute reality of it that we are not just as divided as we were in June 26, but even more divided? And change will come because change has to come, because British politics is broken. And, Mr. Speaker, we're seeing that change. I've left the Conservative Party with 2 others. I think more will follow. I think we will see the breakup of the 2 parties, and I'm delighted today that the group that I've joined with members from formerly of the Labour Party has now today formed itself into a new political party that will change the face and direction of British politics. That's why we call ourselves Change.org. And I believe that is what the British people are crying out for. Leadership, honesty, integrity and a new way of doing politics. That's the only good thing that will come out of the Brexit chaos.
Thank you. 4-minute limit now applies. Mr Owen Patterson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I will be brief. A pleasure to meet the Honourable Lady for Right Honourable Lady for Broxtowe. I admire her consistency, but she won't agree with what I'm about to say. I'm afraid I didn't agree with what she said. Because this, Mr Speaker, is a very simple question of democracy, sovereignty and accountability. That is why 17.4 million people voted to leave. They were told, you are sovereign, you make a decision, the Commons, as elected, will interpret that. They trusted us. They trusted us to deliver what they voted for. They will be bitterly disappointed. At 11 o'clock tonight, we should be leaving. And we won't be leaving. And that is a terrible blow to the integrity of their trust in us. On this side, it was very clear in our manifesto we would interpret leave to leave the single market, leave the customs union, leave the remit your Court of Justice. The Labour Party pretty well said the same thing. And we know that over 2/3 of members in this House represent seats which said leave. 494 and 498 members voted for the second and third readings to trigger Article 50. At that stage, perhaps members opposite were sort of stunned by the effect of the referendum. But now I am amazed by the nature of these debates. There was a sense that that enormous vote, that enormous expression of popular demand has faded into the past. It's a bit embarrassing. It's a bit like a bad smell at a dinner party. I press on. Other members want to speak. Let's push on. And it is live. Those people are out there. They believe that this should happen, and they believe we should deliver it. And it's not going back. This cannot be put back in the bottle and screwed away and hidden in a cupboard or put in the fridge. This huge vote will continue. This will continue to dominate our politics. This issue is not going away. So when we look at the detail of what's being proposed, it is extraordinary. The 5th largest economy in the world is proposing to have laws imposed upon it by 27 other countries, many of whom are competitors, who have no incentive to pass law in our interest. We won't be present when the law is made. We won't be able to amend that law. We won't be able to repeal that law, and if we don't apply that law to the satisfaction of the European Commission and ultimately the European Court of Justice, as we saw in the UQ last week, we are subject to unlimited fines, disallowance in EU speak. We have the horror of Northern Ireland. The whole basis of getting the unionist population to vote for the Belfast Agreement was the principle of consent. It was an extraordinarily successful campaign by my noble friend Lord Trimble. It was an amazing effort to get unionists to vote for it. The basis was trust, that the status of Northern Ireland could not be changed. And yet we're going to have something horrible called UKNI, which is actually even in breach of the Acts of Union of 1801. So trust and democracy. I'm sorry, others want to speak. This is about trust and democracy. And the last key point, the absolute key point, is that what we're seeing today does not deliver. It does not deliver on the referendum. It does not deliver on those manifesto commitments. It does not deliver on all promised through all those debates. And when it comes down to trust, I represent a Leave constituency. I was quite clear to my constituents what I was going to do. they will think it's perverse that I voted twice against this agreement. Why on earth would I, under pressure, change my mind today? So I will maintain my integrity and reputation, intending to campaign and continue. We may lose this particular battle, but ultimately we will get back the sovereignty of this country so people can make decisions.
BNC Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman from North Shropshire, with whom I disagree, but that will not surprise him. I did, however, vote with him for Article 50 2 years ago, and in that debate and in that speech, I spoke to the Prime Minister and I said that she needed to reach out across the chamber to create consensus on Brexit. I also spoke to colleagues in the Labour Party that they needed to reach out to find consensus on Brexit too. Since that day, we have had no consensus at all from the Prime Minister. And that is why, on March the 29th, today, the last day, we are having this debate now. Now, what I want to do is commend the right honourable gentleman, the member for West Dorset, for the procedure that he started and we managed to get through earlier this week, and which I think really brings us forward for the first time in a long time to trying to find a solution to this very difficult problem. Because it is a hugely difficult problem. There are questions about democratic legitimacy. There are important issues which divide fundamentally all of our constituents, and we know that different people, for different people, Brexit means different things. And what we must do as parliamentarians on each side of the chamber is seek consensus. So that meant, for me, earlier this week, for the first time, I actually supported the Beckett Amendment, which supported a referendum, which I have been very, very reluctant to do, because I've come round to the position adopted by the right honourable member for Rushcliffe that referendums are very bad things, upon which he has been sensibly consistent for a very, very long period. But what we don't have today is a solution. A solution before us. Because what we have is something which I must confess I contemplated at one stage. Can we, in fact, I discussed it with the shadow gentleman, the shadow member for Brexit, spokesman for Brexit. Yeah, please don't interrupt me. So I did consider this myself, but then I looked at the law, and what the law says in the European Union Withdrawal Act is that these issues have to be considered together. Yeah. And also, what the Prime Minister has consistently said, until she has reached the last day, is that these issues must be considered together. And what we have also seen is a beauty parade by cynical individuals who are seeking personal advancement within the Conservative Party, reversing their position today because their competitors have reversed their position, and the honest challenges that we are seeking as members of Parliament are not being supported. So what we need to do, and what I will do, is vote against this motion today, and I will then, on Monday, be looking for consensus so that this Parliament can begin to take back control and act responsibly in a way that this Prime Minister has singularly failed to do. We could have achieved consensus across these benches months, even years ago. The Prime Minister has not sought it. Parliament needs to do that now.
Rebecca Powell.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to support this motion, but I've been driven to speak, and I haven't spoken in many of these debates before. We've heard time and time again from all the same people, but not much from what I call the voices of reason. So I'm speaking, Mr. Speaker, because I am exasperated, and I am fed up with the bickering that has gone on in this House. It cannot be beyond the wit of the men and women of this great place to come to a decision that puts the good of the nation first. Every single day of obfuscation, and I can't say that very well because I'm so exasperated, causes more difficulties for the businesses of this country. We rely on these businesses to fuel our economy, to give us jobs, so that people can work and then we can pay taxes and we can have the public services that we need. And a recent straw poll that I undertook of businesses clearly highlights they want a decision, they want it now, and they do not want it in a year's time. And so many individuals seem to confess they don't understand half of what we're debating in this place, and the other half of them wish they'd never heard of it all. So I don't profess to be legal, but what I do know is that we have to make a decision. 52% of people in Taunton Deane voted out, 48% voted leave. And I said I would respect this decision. I've moved my position from being Remain, and I am putting the country first. Very, very quickly, because of the time.
In giving way. Others have said there's a cynical reason for people moving their position. I resigned in November from all government positions and party positions when I saw the legal risk on the backstop. However, now there is a bigger risk with regards to not delivering Brexit at all, and the country's interest comes first. Does you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100% I agree with you. And yes, 17.4 million people voted that they wanted to leave. Yes, there was a roar for change, but 16.8 million gave a yell to be noticed as well. So that does indicate that we do need to have compromise. We've had nearly 3 years of debate in this place, and I asked colleagues during this debate how many people have really changed their position. The polarisation is quite frankly disturbing. So today let's demonstrate that we can move one small step for Parliament and one giant step for the UK and the men and women of this nation by passing the withdrawal agreement, the legally binding agreement that sets out the UK's departure from the EU bloc, that fits with the EU rules and the longer extension that was agreed to May the 22nd. It is a legal right, as the Attorney-General clearly outlined, and it takes us straight to the bill, which was also touched on by the member from Chingford. Let's not forget that both Labour and Conservatives committed to honouring the results of the referendum. And I ask right honourable and honourable members and friends from both sides, can we really countenance voting against Brexit on the day Brexit was meant to be Brexit? I find it extraordinary. By setting out the agreement from the political declaration that sets out the framework for the future relationship, we can go on to continue to discuss what type of Brexit we really want, and it has to be something that we can all live with. I still firmly believe the PM's deal was a good one. She has fought doggedly and determinedly. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. And I believe she's come up with a very comprehensive deal and that it fundamentally is good. But I did vote in the indicative votes, and actually I did maybe what people might think is a bit of a strange thing. I voted aye to two completely contrasting things. One was a closer relationship with the Customs Union, and one was a relationship for the EEA EFTA, because I just felt that I had to indicate that, you know, we do need to come to a consensus in this place. Neither were my favourites. Neither, I think, are as good as the Prime Minister's deal. But for today, let's please, Mr. Speaker, get this over the line. Let's discuss all the other permutations later. Let's demonstrate to the nation that we can all work together, at least for today. Let's make it step by step. And I've always said, I say this to my children, to my husband, who is not very well, who is watching this at home. Step by step, all things are possible. And as the sun shines down on a glorious spring day in Taunton Deane, let's bring some of that sunshine to the rest of the nation and vote for this today.
And it is an honour to follow the honourable member from Taunton Deane. Another day, another Brexit vote, which isn't quite the Brexit vote we need, doesn't quite have the numbers it needs to win, doesn't quite give constituents, companies or our four countries the certainty they require, yet here we are again. The British state is beset with the Tory Westminster government behaving like Olympian gods, as though our constituents, many of whom have livelihoods which depend on our relationship with Europe, as though we were mere pawns in their chess game. They insist on bringing forward meaningful votes after vote after vote, knowing that they produce absolutely nothing. but pretending as if they were doing something. This is nothing more than deceit, duplicity and deception from a government in desperation. And then the Prime Minister has the audacity to go on national television and blame us, members of this House, for her failure as head of state to govern.
Well said.
Mr. Speaker, we are ensnared in a morass of procedural minutiae and twists and turns of Byzantine complexity, a 6-volume Gibson's Decline and Fall of the British Empire, played out in painfully tedious slow motion in what used to be held in respect as the mother of parliaments.
Well said.
And we cannot discuss the failure of this House without turning to the benches on this side. We were so helpfully reminded this week, everyone was reminded, Labour is not a Remain party, and don't we know it?
Indeed.
If the Labour Party had done its sole job and opposed any of the disastrous moves by this government, and not simply closed its eyes and wished upon its negotiation-free Brexit, we would now have a clear way forward. We will not be clinging on to the whims of the ERG and the intransigence of the DUP. Alas, for as long as we stick to this archaic, dysfunctional Westminster system, we are stuck with Her Majesty's opposition, complicit with Her Majesty's government. I will give way.
Grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. She mentions the ERG. If Her Majesty's government had followed the whims of the ERG, we would be in a much better position today.
And of course,
There's time for that yet, Jacob?
Yes.
Did you watch this on the chat?
The ERG do what suits best for them. And the ERG are, of course, as we are seeing, many of them allowed to change their opinion.
Yep.
If only the people of the nations of the United Kingdom were allowed as much as well. But, and I would say this to Labour, if Wales leaves Europe because of Labour members, Labour fiefdom in Wales is at an end. If Labour abandons the interests of Wales, Wales will abandon Labour. This House, at the behest of both the Brexiteering unionist parties, has so far failed to make any decision about about our future relationship with the European Union. The blame is at their door. We have suggested ways forward to marshal decision-making, with my honourable friend, the member for Carmarthen East and Dunevor, suggesting indicative votes, using an alternative voting system to decide how we proceed. This was first raised weeks upon weeks ago, way back before the government lost its first meaningful vote. If the Prime Minister had pulled her fingers out of her ears and listened to anyone other than the privileged elite of the ERG and the DUP, the elite of the Brexiteers, we could have used the last 2.5 months to make some progress, decide on what the House thinks is the best way to move forward, and simply get on with it. And it cannot be said often enough, how often is the Prime Minister going to game democracy for her own purpose? How many ERGers will switch their votes and their previous principles on the most spurious of thin reasons? Will they not open their eyes and see that representative parliamentary democracy in this place has stalled? And if it's good enough for the Tories to have multiple shots, how do they have the nerve to argue that the people are somehow unworthy of a final say referendum? Bring on a people's vote, our salvation in public democracy. To close, Mr. Speaker, we are where we are because of this tin-eared, time-wasting, timorous British government, hell-bent on putting its own interests before the interests of farmers, factory workers and families across the UK. If this is the best the Commons can cobble together, we are in serious trouble. Britain is broken and Westminster is simply not working. The people of Wales deserve better than this failed empire of a union. The timbers of this ship of state are rotten, and Wales must look to Europe and to ourselves for salvation. Dear
John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I voted against Meaningful Vote 1 and 2, and I will be voting against Meaningful Vote 3 this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. And let us be absolutely clear, no matter how it's dressed up by the government, this is a vote on the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement. And I think it's a bad deal, a very, very bad deal. And I think part of the reason we've arrived at this point in which the House cannot support the deal is because the negotiating team
saw Brexit as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity to be seized upon. And furthermore, they never convinced the EU that we were prepared to walk away. And in any negotiation, if the other side really don't think you're prepared to walk away, it makes for a worse deal. And I sympathise very much with my colleagues, particularly those who voted Brexit, because this is a very difficult decision. To choose between the devil and the deep blue sea is never easy. But I've decided again to vote against this meaningful vote because it is such a disastrous deal. It's a disastrous deal on two fronts. And it's if I may, no, I'm going to make progress, and I'll tell you why. If I have time, if I finish beforehand, I will take the intervention. But a lot of people want to speak, a lot of members want to speak in this debate. But there are two central questions that the government has continued to fail to answer. The first was raised by our friends, the DUP, who made it very clear that actually the meaningful vote would put a border, an internal border, within the United Kingdom. And it's not just the DUP who believe this, it is all the unionist parties in Northern Ireland. And we should not take that lightly. It would actually threaten our United Kingdom. But I also suggest, Mr. Speaker, there's a further reason. I think we should be wary of this agreement tonight, and that is, it is very possible, I'm not going to take an intervention from the front bench that has negotiated a disastrous deal for us, and it's as simple as that, I'm sorry.
Will you take an intervention from
no, I'm not. I do apologise. That's very kind. Very kind.
Will you give way?
Go on then, I'll give way. Go on then. No, actually, I won't give way to the right. I did promise the right honourable gentleman there, or the gentleman there.
The honourable gentleman says he believes this is a bad deal. At a time when businesses' investment is at its lowest, why does he think that all manufacturing industries believe that this is a good deal that should be supported?
Because he will remember, as I do, the dire predictions that if we voted to leave in 2016 that never materialised. They were so poor that actually the Bank of England and many others had to publicly apologise, and since then we've seen record low unemployment, record high manufacturing output and record investment, and those decisions in recent years have been made on the basis that we could be leaving on no-deal WTO terms. But, Mr. Speaker, the second reason I'm going to continue for a little bit. The second reason I'm going to be voting against this agreement tonight is because of the indefinite nature of the backstop. I fully agree with those who say there's a need for compromise. I do not like the transition arrangement. But I can hold my nose to it because, in a sense, it's no worse than being in the EU. But what I find very difficult to swallow is the indefinite nature of the backstop, because I can't imagine there'd be anybody in this place who would enter a very serious legal arrangement, an agreement that only gave the key to exit to the other party. And we could be locked in this backstop indefinitely. That is not delivering on the results of the EU referendum. It's not delivering on the extension or the triggering of Article 50. It's not delivering on the referendum, on the general election result, in which both parties committed to honouring the referendum in their manifestos. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, Article 50 we triggered. The legal default position of that triggering, and we passed it by 384 majority, is that we would leave with or without a deal. Monday's motions are going to be addressing the central issue of whether we leave on WTO terms if we cannot pass the Prime Minister's deal today, and I'd encourage the House to give it consideration.
Mark Hendrick.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the member for Basildon and Billericay, who I've jousted with on many an occasion in the Foreign Affairs Committee. But as you'd expect, Mr. Speaker, my views are very different, although we draw the same conclusion on this deal today. I will be voting against this deal today because I believe it is a trap. and a final attempt by the Prime Minister to leave us in a situation where it will be her deal or no deal. And that is the situation which she wants to create on the 22nd of May, should this deal pass today. But hopefully it won't. During the last 2 years, 18 months has been wasted because the Prime Minister would not discuss with Parliament, nor her government, what was being discussed and negotiated with the EU. After 18 months, the Prime Minister produced the so-called Chequers Plan, which was roundly rejected by many of her own MPs, as well as other members of Parliament. That plan formed the basis for negotiations, leading to the resignations of cabinet ministers and deep divisions in the party opposite. The stubbornness of the Prime Minister in running down the clock has left us in the embarrassing position and situation that we are in today. Still, we are debating this on the day that we were due to leave the European Union. Mr. Speaker, let me discuss the separation of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, because the way that this has been put forward today would seem to me to be a blank cheque, if it's passed, for the new Conservative Prime Minister to put through what I would regard as a hard right Brexit deal through in the future. And we can already see the leadership candidates trying to outright each other, look more to the right than each other, in the run-up to a competition which I believe has already started, and started from the moment the Prime Minister issued her resignation at the 1922 committee. And what we will see is whatever is agreed by this government, and particularly by a new Prime Minister, is some hard-right version, possibly a Canada-style international trade agreement. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm a member now of the International Trade Committee, and I've seen the International Trade Secretary talk about rollovers, and the EU currently has something like 40 international trade agreements. And at the moment, only 8 of those look in any way, shape or form as though they could possibly be rolled over. And if we look at who they're with, very, very minor countries, none of which are of the size and mass of the market that we face in the European Union. And the European Union are still, even though we will leave the European Union, will still be, I believe, the major trading partner, irrespective of what many of the Brexiteers and flat earthers on the other side of this chamber will say. Now, to consider this motion in isolation from the political declaration, as I said, is to give the power to any new Conservative Prime Minister to actually make a mess of our relations in terms of trade with the rest of the world. I think investment decisions, location is key, and the businesses at the moment, irrespective of what the Attorney General said earlier on, is actually going to upset a lot of businesses. And it's not just about when we leave, it's about how we leave. The deal is key, and that's why I think the indicative process that we've already started was important, and I think what we do on Monday is key. But I will be voting down with other colleagues this deal today in the hope that we can get a good agreement on Monday. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
3-minute limit now applies. Mr. David Jones.
Speaker, today's debate is proceeding for one reason only. It's not being held, as my right honourable friend the Attorney General acknowledged, with a view to delivering a positive, meaningful vote for the purposes of the Act. Indeed, it's hard to see how another meaningful vote could be held, since there has been no change whatever to the withdrawal agreement, which was so convincingly rejected by this House only 2 weeks ago. The European Union has made it clear that the withdrawal agreement cannot be reopened, and you yourself, Mr. Speaker, have made it absolutely clear that you would not countenance the last rejected motion being put to the House again. So the motion before us today does not fulfil the statutory requirements of the Act. We are being asked to approve it for one reason only, and that is to keep the clock ticking, to ensure that that can that has been so repeatedly kicked doesn't complete its progress down the road on the 12th of April, but bumps along a bit until the 22nd of May. And to be fair to the government, they're openly acknowledging that that is the case. But they're also saying ostensibly and illogically, that today we are considering the withdrawal agreement separately from the political declaration. That is not the case, Mr. Speaker. It's illogical to say that, because the political declaration is incorporated by reference into the body of the withdrawal agreement. It's there in black and white in Article 184. So, in reality, we are considering the political declaration today. We're, in reality, considering the whole package that we rejected by 149 votes only a few days ago. Mr. Speaker, this was to be the day when we celebrated, or lamented, whichever is our point of view, the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union. It could have been the moment when we put the travails of the last 3 fractious years behind us. But we are not. Humiliatingly, we are going through today's exercise because the government has been told by the European Union that we have until the 22nd of May to sign up to the withdrawal agreement, but only if it's approved by this House by 11 o'clock tonight. Mr. Speaker, if anything had changed, I would have been inclined possibly to consider supporting the motion today. If it had changed like Keynes, I might have been prepared to consider changing my own mind. But nothing has changed, and therefore I won't. The truth is that we're being asked to approve this agreement to buy the government another 40 days, and what a dreadful 40 days it would be. 40 days of increasing frustration for the British people who are wondering why the steeple bells are not pealing out this evening. Mr. Speaker, it's time to bring this miserable business to an end. It's time to deliver Brexit, and I therefore urge all honourable members to oppose this motion this evening.
There was a time when Brexit meant Brexit. These days it seems to mean chaos. This grand plan to demonstrate that the UK has been Gulliver imprisoned in Lilliput for the last 46 years has fallen apart and is broken. And to deal with that Buruk, we have a government so dysfunctional, so bereft of talent and so lacking in trust, the Prime Minister has given up trying to appoint ministers. Its only saving grace is it's opposed by an official loyal opposition that seems incapable of doing anything that might actually help and seems completely at odds with itself. Today we have a Prime Minister who thinks no will turn to yes if you only just ask half of the question, served by a cabinet that includes one minister who thought it appropriate to tell a journalist, "I'm past caring, it's like the living dead in here." Now, I suspect that might have been the Prime Minister herself, but it is an insult to the living dead. Worse is to come, though, if she ever manages to muster enough support to resign to be replaced by a more vicious version of the Bullingdon Club. Something worse than the current government is lying in wait and could be about to be ushered into office by some useful idiots in the Labour Party who have stood in this chamber and preached about principle, about how damaging this deal is. Now they pretend to have found some substantive change which makes it the best possible deal of all possible worlds. They stand on the wrong side of history and on the wrong side of the interests of the people they were paid to represent. Now, I represent a constituency opposed to Brexit, and I am proud to say that I agree with my constituency. We want to keep our links with the EU because we understand the benefits of that, and especially the benefits of freedom of movement. Absolutely. 10% of the population of Edinburgh North and Leith are non-UK citizens of the EU, more than twice the UK average. We also have higher numbers than average from elsewhere in Europe and from elsewhere in the world. We also have a higher number of immigrants from England than the Scottish average. Every one of them is welcome. We understand the benefits of immigration and the cultural and economic value that immigrants bring. We understand just how damaging Brexit would be, particularly a chaotic Brexit. This deal, this pile of manure we are being offered as an appetizer for the slurry to come would do harm to my constituents. It is offered by a Prime Minister who has run out of road and who has no other ideas. That is no basis on which to recommend anything to anyone, far less a future to our countries. It is time to go back to the people and say this is what Brexit actually is. Would you like to go through with this, or would you rather revoke Article 50 and let them have a choice with at least some idea of what the choice actually is?
Steve Brine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's not that challenging to follow. It's a shame to be back here on the back benches, Mr. Speaker, after 3 years. And I may have been down there on the front bench, but I've sat through a lot of these debates. And it seems to me that the Honourable Lady is about to prove my point, that people in this House have spent far too much time listening to respond instead of listening to try and understand. And the entrenchment of positions, as my honourable friend from Taunton Deane said earlier, is part of the problem. Now, my constituency, there are many that voted Remain, probably the majority. There are many that voted Leave, and there are many that weren't old enough and decry the fact they didn't get a chance to take part in. But if we must leave, then we must do so with a withdrawal agreement, is their view. And if that's your position, and that's been mine since day one, then you cannot wish away no deal. And so that's why I've supported the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement twice. But I came to the conclusion, Mr. Speaker, that we can't just keep hoping that that withdrawal agreement gets over the line. And from the speeches I've heard in here today, I think it is unlikely it will get over the line today. Therefore, we have to have a plan B. We had to have a parallel process, which is what I left the government to support earlier this week. And it was never going to produce a conclusive result on Wednesday. We never expected it to do so. But if the withdrawal agreement part falls tonight, then Monday becomes more important than ever. And if you don't believe in leaving with no withdrawal agreement, as I don't, and I believe the Prime Minister doesn't, and many, many people in this House, a big majority in this House, it's because you want to respect the result of the referendum, whether you regret it or not, but you want to do so in a safe way and produce a safe exit from the European Union. A people's vote, a revoke. People write to me all the time and say it's very obvious we need to hand it back to the people. That will solve this. It might produce an outcome, but it isn't consequence-free, as was voting against the withdrawal agreement the second time and tonight. There will be consequences to whatever this House decides tonight. So I'm clear that voting for the withdrawal agreement this afternoon is the right thing to do. It does move us. It moves us forward. It moves us out of a constitutional arrangement with the EU into a treaty arrangement. And my honourable friend from Cheltenham put it very well earlier when he said that the key points is simplicity. It's about the financial settlement, because this is a country that honours those financial settlements. It's about citizens' rights, which matters greatly to me and to my constituents. And it's about the implementation period that business was crystal clear it needs to deliver that safe exit.
Thank you. Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the honourable member for Winchester, and I very much hope that he will now join the all-party parliamentary group on acquired brain injury, since he's got some spare time. Round and round and round and round we go. It's not so much a stuck record, it's like a record played at the wrong speed is what it feels like at the moment. And frankly, it's about time we change direction. I'm going to vote against this today because I think it's a pretty... The Minister looks depressed and upset, like I've let him down terribly. But the truth is, this is a ludicrous attempt at a body swerve by the government. And this House decided in this parliamentary session what was the proper process for proceeding. First of all, a meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration all in one. That's what this House decided and enacted in this session. And secondly, that there should then be an Act of Parliament to implement it. Now, I feel that what the government actually intends to do is to use the Withdrawal Agreement Implementation Bill to repeal Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act. And yet we've already made that decision about what the proper process is in this session of Parliament. So I don't think that they will be able to do so, which is why today doesn't provide more certainty, as the Attorney-General argued, if we pass the motion tonight. It provides more uncertainty because we will still have to go through the process of a full, meaningful vote. The Prime Minister, up until this moment, has always agreed with me on this point. Her manifesto expressly says that the political declaration and the Withdrawal Act must be taken together. Her manifesto says it, and she's always preaching to us about manifestos, so I'm preaching back to her. She also said repeatedly Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and I agree with the Right Honourable Member for Stone that we should never be separating out the divorce settlement and the custody of the children. The whole thing has to go together. That is an intrinsic fundamental principle. Now, there may be good reasons for voting for this motion, and I fully accept that many ministers, I accept that ministers adopt them. But it worries me that so many have said that they absolutely loathe this deal, but are nonetheless intending to support it today. Those are not good reasons. The European Research Group said, of the agreement, we will become a vassal state, many of whose laws will have been created abroad and over which we have no influence. How could they possibly vote for us? This is a constitutional crisis. We need a settlement that will last for generations. There is a deep, deep wound in the body politic, and a sticking plaster really won't suffice. We need to stitch the nation back together, and we can only do that if we proceed in good order. No more parliamentary shenanigans, no more partisan jiggery-pokery and behind-stairs work, no more subjugating the national interest to private ambition. Mrs. Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. They say in life there's over two certainties, death and taxes. Well, I'd like to add one more to the list. The certainty is that this House is a Remainer House. This House will resist kicking and screaming every opportunity to try and take this country legally out of the European Union. And I have listened to every speech in this House today, so I'm pleased to be called. And I've made a note of some of the comments that have been made. And the Honourable Member for Loch Skye and Loch Arbour said the voice of Remain will be heard. We must stop Brexit. We will never accept Brexit. I have to say, those sort of comments, and I've heard other versions of them today, have changed the context for people like myself who voted against the withdrawal deal on both occasions. I find it deeply undemocratic that the method put in place by the Honourable Member for West Dorset suggests that we are having a voting pattern, which we've already had one of, where we are expected to vote in a half-an-hour slot on 8 or more options that we have not debated or tested in this House, that we have not had any legal information in this House, that we have not had the Attorney General's view on this House, that we have not run past the European Union to see if it's acceptable to them. And yet we're supposed to say that this is a democracy and that this actually is going to deliver a consensus. What it will deliver is a bogus consensus, because what will happen, particularly if this happens on Monday, that may end up becoming preferential votes, I don't know, could be it's an amendable motion. Yeah. What we will have is, despite having 2 years of debate about this particular withdrawal agreement and examined its flaws in minutiae, and there are many, what we will have is the potential to go to something far, far worse. So the context of this has changed for myself, and I know for some other honourable members. This is a very, very difficult decision for many colleagues. Yeah. But I know the siren voices from opposite, and there have been plenty of them. I have had 680 emails, as many do, on this topic alone, and I have had most of those emails, all but 80, are from the Remain side of the argument, because they see that this withdrawal agreement, with all its flaws, is the one way that they can stop Brexit. So today, I am changing my vote because I am not being cowed into going down a process that on Monday means I'm expected to make a choice over somebody else's selection of what they think Brexit should mean. That I'm not going to choose on behalf of my constituents and the country as a whole based on something that's had no debate, no scrutiny, and because a Remainer Parliament is hoping against hope that this deal, which is the best of the ugliest of sisters, that this deal will be struck out today in the fervent hope that they can bring something far softer or not at all. And for all those saying about a second referendum, I hope they can explain to the British people how by the time they get one on the doorstep, it's current.
Mr. Speaker, this is the third time that we have considered this issue. The government says this is not meaningful vote 3. And they will not count it as meaningful vote 3 if they lose today, but they would certainly count it as meaningful vote 3 if they won today. Now, a number of MPs today, honourable members, right honourable members, have said that they have changed their mind between vote 1, vote 2 and vote 3. And there will be many people in the country asking themselves, why is it that MPs can vote 3 and maybe 4 times and are entitled to change their minds, but it would be the greatest democratic calamity of all, according to the Prime Minister, to give the public one vote on this deal and give them the right to change their minds. And two things are different about how we're doing this today. The first is the separation of the political declaration from the withdrawal agreement. And the second is the starting gun being fired on a Tory leadership contest. Yes. The political declaration was already vague, but separating it out from the withdrawal agreement makes this the most blindfold Brexit. And we are being asked to vote to leave with no idea at all of what the future relationship between the UK and the EU will be. And no attempt to answer the fundamental question that Brexit poses. Do we want a more distant economic relationship where, in all likelihood, Northern Ireland will have to be treated differently from the rest of the UK? Or do we want a close economic relationship where we continue to obey the EU's rules, yet give ourselves no say over them? That question must be answered. And now we are being asked to give all of this, to mortgage all of this, to the outcome of a Tory leadership contest, where the battle will be between candidates trying to prove that they are the truest believer of all. Exactly. Mirror, mirror on the wall will be the question. Who's the most right-wing nationalist of them all? That is what the candidates will be asking. Now, if the Prime Minister wins tonight, I would contend that the battering ram approach to parliamentary democracy will still not bring the country together. This has not been good enough as a process. And if she loses, she will have a decision to make. This House had made clear its opposition to no deal, so the Prime Minister will have to decide on the future, a longer extension and a recasting of the process if this goes down tonight.
Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, I was rather hoping tonight to be able to crack open some champagne and celebrate the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, I'm more likely to be reaching out for the antidepressants as a consequence, because we're not leaving the European Union, and that's because Brexit has been treated as a problem and choreographed by people who do not have their heart in it rather than an opportunity to be grasped. My vote on this issue has always been to implement Brexit, and it will continue to be so. We need to restore the sovereignty that we've lost to the European Union over the last 40 years. And that's why I voted against extending Article 50. I voted to keep no deal on the table, and I voted twice against this deal, which has so many fundamental flaws in it. We've all witnessed, Mr. Speaker, how this House has voted to take over control of the order paper. We've seen how it's wanted to extend Article 50 and to rule out no deal, and to consider a customs union and even no Brexit. And I believe that we will witness it implement the softest of soft Brexits, if at all, if this deal falls today. There are some who believe that still, that if this deal falls, that no deal can somehow happen, that the European Union will, instead of accepting £1 billion a month off of us, will refuse to accept an extension of Article 50. I simply cannot see that happening at all. On the contrary, I believe if we vote against the government today, the European Union will extend Article 50 for a lengthy period of time. So we have a choice, Mr. Speaker, today, to accept this deal and all of its faults, or to risk losing Brexit completely. There is no certainty in either direction today. It is a balance of risk, as has often been said on both sides of the House. But I fear, and my greatest fear, is that we lose Brexit entirely if we vote this down today. And that's exactly what could happen. I agree with many of the criticisms that have been levelled against this deal, the impact that it will have on Northern Ireland and the lack of ability for the UK to leave unilaterally. My decision to vote for this is in some ways harder than the decision I took to resign from the Whip's office. but circumstances have changed. I have not. We are now between a rock and a hard place. It is an an unenviable situation that we find ourselves in, and we should not have been put in this position. It is this deal today, or we submit ourselves to a customs union and the potential of losing Brexit forever. I believe passionately that Britain's best place is outside of the European Union, and that's why I'll be voting with the government.
Vernon Coker.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On reflection, and having sat here listening to the debate this morning and this afternoon, what a catastrophic strategic failure of leadership we've seen from the government to reach this position. A position where, as Parliament, we remain divided, and we remain divided as a country. And I was extremely disappointed that the reaction to the indicative votes that took place the other day, instead of the government responding to that and looking at that and saying, does that offer us a way forward? Is there a way of bringing those together which would actually command a majority of this House and command a majority of the country? Instead of that, we got the government crowing from their front bench that no particular option had got a majority. That is no way to bring the country together. That is no way to bring the Parliament of this country together. And I say to the government, even at this late stage, they should be seeking to look to see what would command a majority in this House and what would actually command a majority in the country. But instead of that, what do we get? We get a motion today which this House is asked to pass, and I'll be voting against it with many of my colleagues, asked to pass, which sets aside Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act. It sets aside the British law. It sets aside the law of this country, which says the withdrawal agreement will be passed with the political declaration and will be passed with the consent of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Let me say this to the Minister and to the Government. I think the British public will be astonished that the Government, in order to push through its withdrawal agreement, even though it's been defeated twice, has come up with a ruse which allows it to say we will separate out the political declaration and we will set aside for our purposes the British law. They will not understand it, and frankly, neither do I. Let me say this as well. The political declaration, the people of this country should know that if the Withdrawal Act is passed today, there is no certainty about what that means for the political declaration. No certainty about single market, no certainty about customs union, no certainty about many of the other things that matter to the people of this country. As I said at the beginning, it is a catastrophic failure of leadership by the government and a continuing failure by the government to seek to bring Parliament together and this country together.
Free Clifton Brown.
Speaker, I'm very grateful to catch your eye in this important debate. I'm sure my constituents will have noted my assiduousness, having been here for over 4 hours to speak for 3 minutes. An improvement on last time, it was 2 minutes after 4 hours. Mr. Speaker, I had hoped, listening to this debate today, this historic debate, that we might see honourable members and right honourable members in this House honouring their manifestos and the last election to actually honour the result of the referendum to leave the European Union. But actually, having listened to the debate today, it sounds as though that's going to be unlikely. And therefore, we're likely to move to indicative votes on Monday, where I suspect the common consensus emerging is that there may well be some form of a customs union. Just, my honourable member, leave it for a minute. Many members of this House believe that this may be a way out of this whole conundrum. I have to tell the House, Mr. Speaker, it most certainly is not, because it will not eliminate the needs for customs checks. There will still be a need to be checks on plants, animals, regulations and standards. The UK would be similar to Turkey, and we would need movement certificates for all goods that are going to be exported to the EU.
I'm grateful to an honourable friend like me. He was here during the Maastricht debates
And isn't there a political judgment to make today that if we do not vote for the withdrawal agreement, we may never leave the European Union at all?
My honourable friend reads my mind, and I'm going to come on to precisely that subject in a minute. But above all, the EU will require checks at the Northern Irish border. So I say to my good friends in the DUP, a customs union certainly will not solve the Northern Ireland problem. Crucially, if the customs union is accompanied by closer alignment, for example with Common Market 2 or EEA or EFTA or Norway Plus, this means that we would have to honour EU competition laws, laws on state aids and customs legislation. Well, this means that the Labour Party's policies on nationalisation will be illegal under EU law, so they will be facing two ways at the same time. If we vote for this withdrawal agreement today, we can come to full trade agreements with high-growth countries in the rest of the world, none of which, sadly, are in the European Union. Coming to my honourable friend's point, the alternative, I believe, to not voting for this withdrawal agreement today, and all it does, Mr Deputy Speaker, is take us to the next stage, to the withdrawal and implication bill, which can be fully scrutinised by this House, it can be fully amended, the problems that my honourable friend for Stone has outlined about not leaving the European Communities Act, all of these things can be rectified in that bill. But if we don't get as far as that bill, we will go back to the indicative process. So coming to my honourable friend's point, I believe the alternative is to risk a long delay in Article 50 after April the 12th. This means, crucially, we will fight European elections. Fighting European elections almost 3 years after the British people voted to leave the European Union. And then my prediction is that we will finally go for a long extension of Article 50, during which time everybody will say we must revoke it. Our trust with the British people will then be broken.
That's right.
Democracy and faith in this Parliament will be severely damaged.
Right.
I urge all colleagues to vote for this agreement today.
Mr Speaker, Britain can leave the European Union in one of two ways. We could choose to reject EU regulation altogether. The downside would be severe damage to our economy, highlighted by Honda's Swindon plant closure, cancellation of Nissan models in Sunderland. Recent votes, I think, show the House rightly recognises that danger of no deal and isn't willing to go down that road. The alternative is to protect the economy, stay close to Europe, but the problem with that is having to apply EU rules, but no longer having any say over what the rules are. That is the Brexit choice. Move away from the EU, take the economic hit, or stay close, reduce the economic hit, but have no say over the rules. Now, Mr Speaker, one of the reasons we're in the problem we're in today is we do not know the Prime Minister's choice. We don't know which of those two she favours. The political declaration was supposed to tell us, but it doesn't. Even if we did know the Prime Minister's choice, she's stepping down, so someone else will have to make it. But I do understand the Prime Minister's unwillingness to choose. Both options have severe downsides. That's why many of us opposed leaving the EU in the first place. But how can we sign off the deal without having some idea of where we're going to end up? All we do know is the Prime Minister's choice for the transition period, that is, for that initial period to stay close. We'll gain control over migration from the EU, but we will lose our influence over rules we'll have to adhere to on data privacy, on financial services, on product standards in a whole host of areas. Some, I think, worried about migration from the EU may think that is a reasonable exchange. I cannot see that it is. One example, Mr Speaker, to illustrate the problem. We've conscientiously implemented GDPR data privacy rules. The UK played a key role in drawing them up. The Prime Minister rightly recognises we're going to have to continue to follow them so we can carry on exchanging data easily with the EU. So she announced she wanted to keep our place on the European Data Protection Board, which oversees GDPR. But she couldn't achieve that in her negotiation. Under the withdrawal agreement, we'll lose our place on the day we leave the EU. We'll no longer have any say on the rules, but we will still have to comply with them. And writ large, that is the position we'll find ourselves in across the board. Mr. Speaker, we do need a longer extension. We need a consensus-building process which is going to take time, and I urge the House to reject the deal today.
Sir Mike Penning.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and I've sat through the debates this afternoon. I'm not going to take any interventions because I want colleagues to get in as well. We need to talk about trust. The British public are fed up with Brexit, and they're fed up with us. The vast majority of us in this chamber stood on a manifesto to honour the referendum result. I respect those that didn't, but the majority of us did. But this House, whether we like it to admit it or not, is a Remain House.
Absolutely.
The Labour Party would like to bring this government down, and they quite clearly see this as an opportunity to do that. That's an opposition's job. I can understand that. We was in opposition for long enough. But what is fundamentally wrong is standing on a manifesto to say you honour the referendum result and then do every single thing you can in this House to delay, change, make it soft, do whatever other language we want to use to do that. And I'm not going to give way. I've already said I'm not going to give way, and I'm not going to give way so there's others. We can build the trust again in the British public. But we're going to do that if we compromise, not compromising like the Scottish National Party we were talking about earlier on, which is we don't leave, not saying we want to be in a union, not saying, yet again I'm so popular, Mr. Speaker, but actually I'm pleased the Prime Minister's here because this is fundamental. If there are people that are in the leadership campaigns and want to replace the Prime Minister, for God's sake, put that in the back burner till we get this through. We are not voting this evening on the bill. What we're doing is voting to get onto the bill so we can have the amendments, we can have those changes that so many colleagues are considering, including my friends from Northern Ireland. Colleagues stood on a piece of paper that said, I will honour it. They will have to go back to their constituencies and say, I have honoured the referendum result as I promised you. I will have to go back and say that I've compromised because I don't like the agreement. Most of us don't like the agreement. But it's a damn sight better than sticking two fingers up to the British public and say we can ignore you. And that, basically, is what is happening for MPs in this House whose constituents voted to leave, not with caveats, not with bits and bobs, leave or stay, and leave is what we should do. But I am petrified that this House is going to block the will of the British people, which is why I will support the amendment to the motion this evening.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has run down the clock in an attempt to blackmail MPs at every turn. This government is in chaos. The country is in chaos, and the responsibility for this chaos is the government's and the government's alone. The Prime Minister pulled the meaningful vote in December because she knew it would fail. And since then, in more than 3 months, nothing has changed. Not one single word in the 600 pages of the withdrawal agreement, not one single word in the 26 pages of the political declaration has changed. Today, Mr. Speaker, the government is trying to bounce this House into voting for a damaging deal that we have twice rejected. But as ever, the Prime Minister refuses to listen. Today's vote, third time lucky, the Prime Minister hopes, is an affront to democracy and an affront to this country. Separating the withdrawal agreement from the future relationship when the Prime Minister told us the two were indivisible. This is what she said to the House on the 14th of January, and I quote, "The link between the political declaration and the withdrawal agreement means that the commitments of one cannot be banked without the commitments of the other." Today, the Prime Minister is asking us to take a punt on the withdrawal agreement and hope the best for a political declaration. It's not good enough. The two are linked. And nothing, Mr. Speaker, demonstrates that linkage more than the backstop. The reality is The political declaration is incredibly vague, and there are, in it, I quote, a spectrum of possible outcomes. Nothing is even close to being resolved. That makes it even more likely that the UK would fall into the backstop, which creates regulatory divergence between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, as the Honourable Member for East Antrim said. And we know, Mr. Speaker, it endures indefinitely thanks to this Parliament prizing the Attorney-General's legal advice out of a very reluctant government. Labour will not vote for a blindfold Brexit, and passing the withdrawal agreement today without the political declaration would be to do just that. The Prime Minister said at the end of November, when she signed off the deal, "We won't agree the leaving part, the withdrawal agreement, until we get what we want in the future, because these two go together." And as the Honourable Member, my friend the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South, said in his speech, it would be selling the house without knowing where we're moving to. Although, unlike me, I'm really not sure he's old enough to have watched Monty Python. Finally, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful indeed to the Leader of the Opposition for allowing me to intervene with him. The Leader of the Opposition should be enormously proud of the achievement of the Labour Party in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. And therefore, I am extremely upset and very disappointed that the Labour Party today will vote against the Prime Minister's Brexit deal, which protects the Good Friday Agreement and the consent principle.
Mr. Speaker, we are very proud on this side of the House of the Good Friday Agreement and the peace that's been achieved in Northern Ireland as a result of it. And there's nobody on this side of the House in the Labour Party that wants to do anything to undermine the Good Friday Agreement and the great achievement that it was. The Shadow Solicitor General said Article 184 of the Withdrawal Agreement commits the government to negotiate expeditiously on the terms of the political declaration. That would be a deal based on a very wide range of potential outcomes to the country, and who would decide which direction we go in? Because now that the Prime Minister has announced her own departure, we do not know if we will be getting the future chosen by the Honourable Member for Uxbridge, or the Honourable Member for North East Somerset, or maybe even our jobbing Prime Minister, the Honourable Member for West Dorset. The Labour Party will not play roulette with this country's future, especially when the roulette wheel is rigged by the Conservative Party. Labour respects the results of the referendum. We reiterated that in our manifesto and again in our party conference last year. But this Prime Minister's approach to Brexit has been nothing short of a shambles. The choices facing our country post-Brexit have been decided solely by what is in the interest of the Conservative Party, not what is in the interest of this country. The Prime Minister announced her red lines and went to negotiate without any consultation with this House, without any attempt to build consensus. Those red lines were opposed by the representative bodies of workers, businesses and industry, who are now, Mr. Speaker, tearing their hair out in exasperation at the incompetence of this government and the uncertainty they face. The first Brexit Secretary said he would get a deal that would deliver the exact same benefits as now. The current Brexit Secretary obviously felt that's far too good for the country, because only 2 weeks ago he went in the lobbies to back no deal and to oppose an extension. That would leave the UK crashing out in just 10 days' time with no preparations and chaos at our ports and airports, leading to a crisis in factories, shops and hospitals. And what did the government's forecast say about the Brexit Secretary's preferred no-deal option? That would make the economy not 4% worse off, but nearly 10% worse off. So it's no wonder then that, faced with a choice between the Prime Minister's bad deal and a disastrous no deal, the House, this House, has given a clear no to both repeatedly. The government suffered the largest defeat of any in parliamentary history in January. The Prime Minister said then, and I quote, "It's clear this House does not support this deal." So what's the government's response? It's tried begging, it's tried bullying, it's tried bribery, and it's still defeated by the fourth largest majority in parliamentary history. The Prime Minister told us we must leave on the 29th of March and even wrote that into primary legislation. Then she herself voted against leaving on the 29th of March. So the Prime Minister then went to Brussels to negotiate an extension and almost unbelievably even turned that into another negotiating failure. This government's Brexit negotiations have been a litany of failure, culminating in today with a Prime Minister who's been forced to announce her own departure, only tabling half the deal she has negotiated. This really is a half-baked Brexit. When she became Prime Minister 2.5 years ago, she said it was her mission to deliver Brexit. She has failed. She also stood on the steps of Downing Street and promised that her government would tackle burning injustices. Since then, she's failed every test. Homelessness is up. Life expectancy is falling. Infant mortality is rising. Crime is rising. Police numbers have fallen. And this year's NHS has had its worst ever month on history. People waiting longer in A&E for an operation and to start cancer treatment. And just yesterday, we learned that more children are in poverty and the scourge of pensioner poverty is rising again. The job of government is to make people's lives better, and this government has failed. A botched and half-baked Brexit deal like the one before us today would compound that failure. On Wednesday, the House sought to find an alternative, a new negotiating deal for the government. Labour's plan, and I believe, provides the best compromise for a deeply divided country and, in truth, a deeply divided House. It is backed in large part by major organisations in industry and business and by trade unions. It's based around the certainty of a permanent customs union, close alignment with the single market, and a dynamic alignment on rights and protections. Mr. Speaker, Labour urged support for 4 of the options tabled by members of different parties on different sides of the House. We did so not because we'd be equally happy with each of those outcomes, because we recognise that we have to compromise to get this resolved. The whole House knows that the current uncertainty is damaging businesses, is reducing investment, and is costing jobs now and in the future. And the stress of people in work is palpable as you travel around the country and talk to people in all parts of the country. So I hope on Monday the House retakes control, that parties and members on all sides will enter into those debates and votes in the spirit of trying to find an acceptable compromise. We need to get a better deal. The country deserves a better deal, and I'm convinced that a better deal can be negotiated. And if members decide, the chance for people to have a final say. If we cannot do that on Monday, then I ultimately, and many others would agree with me, say no alternative other than having a general election to decide who rules this country in the future. Mr. Speaker, to enable the Prime Minister to have sufficient time to answer the debate, I say this in conclusion. I urge members today to act in the best interests of their constituents and to vote down this unacceptable deal. There are many people who fear for their jobs, fear for their industry, or whether they or their friends have a future in this country. And that is causing immense stress to many people. However they voted in the referendum in 2016, they are united in their stress and concern about their future and their community's future. We need to rebuild our country and invest in our communities. too many of which have been neglected, ignored and underfunded for years. A botched and half-baked Brexit deal like the one before us today and would only deepen those problems and those divisions. Mr. Speaker, this deal, even the half of it we have before us today, is bad for our democracy, bad for our economy and bad for this country, and I urge the House not to be cajoled on this third-time lucky strategy and vote it down today.
Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, this has been another impassioned debate on Brexit. I've stood here on many occasions over the past few months, answering questions and taking interventions from right honourable and honourable members. What I want to do in the minutes remaining is to set out the serious choice that faces us. Today should have been the day that the United Kingdom left the European Union. That we are not leaving today is a matter of deep personal regret to me. But I remain committed to the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, and that is why I brought this motion to the House today. There are those who will say the House has rejected every option so far. You'll probably lose, so why bother? I bother because this is the last opportunity to guarantee Brexit. And I say to all those who campaigned to leave, who voted to leave, who represent constituencies that voted to leave, indeed all of us who want to deliver on the vote to leave, if we do not vote for this motion today, people will ask, why did you not vote for Brexit? By voting for this motion today, we can send a message to the public and to the European Union that Britain stands by its word and that we will leave the European Union on the 22nd of May. And this is the reason.
I was listening very carefully to her message to all those who have voted to leave in the course of the past few years. What has she possibly said to the 48% actually voted to remain?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that the deal that we have agreed, the arrangements and the proposals that we have put forward absolutely apply to the 48% who voted remain, because they recognise the necessary balance between delivering on the result of the referendum while doing that in a way that protects jobs, protects livelihoods and protects people's security. Mr. Speaker, last week the EU Council agreed that Article 50 could be extended to the 22nd of May if the House approves the withdrawal agreement this week. That would give us enough time to take the withdrawal agreement bill through Parliament. We would not have to hold European parliamentary elections and we would leave the European Union. But they also agreed that if we did not approve the withdrawal agreement by tonight, the extension would only be to the 12th of April, not long enough to ratify a deal. So anyone who wants to leave with a deal would have to support seeking a further extension. Any such extension would probably be a long one, and that would certainly mean holding European elections. So approving the withdrawal agreement today avoids a cliff edge in 2 weeks' time. It avoids European elections. It avoids a long extension which would at least delay and could destroy Brexit. But, Mr. Speaker, to secure this extension, to give us a firm exit date, we do not need to agree the whole deal today, just the withdrawal agreement.
Yes, exactly.
I believe there's an overwhelming majority in this House for the withdrawal agreement. 3/4 of Conservative MPs backed it in the last meaningful vote. And opposition MPs I've spoken to tell me their problem is not with the withdrawal agreement, it's with the political declaration. So I want to address the central argument put forward by the Leader of the Opposition again this afternoon, that voting for the motion will enable a blind Brexit. It will not, and for 3 reasons. First, If you want to leave with a deal, then whatever future relationship you want, it needs to sit alongside this withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement is fixed. It is part of any deal. Second, agreeing this motion today is not ratifying the whole deal. That will only happen once the withdrawal agreement bill has passed through all of its stages in this House and the other place and has received royal assent. What this motion today does is give us the time we need to pass the necessary legislation and complete the current debate which the House is considering about our future relationship. Now, the Government stands by the current political declaration, but we're not asking the House to approve it today. Nor does today's vote prejudge or preempt the outcome of the process run by my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. In fact, for those options being considered, approval of this withdrawal agreement is a prerequisite. And third, in the next phase of negotiations, we've committed to give Parliament a significant and ongoing role in the process. Mr. Speaker, if you had selected the amendment in the name of the honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent Central and others, the Government would have accepted it. And if this motion carries today, we will bring forward a withdrawal agreement bill that will include commitments to implement that amendment, and we'll discuss the specific drafting of that with those who supported the amendment. So by voting for this motion, members are not closing any doors. They will still have the ability, through the withdrawal agreement bill, to influence that future relationship. Today's motion is not about a blind Brexit. It is about a guaranteed Brexit. Today, we can give the public and businesses the certainty. Today, we can give the public and businesses the certainty they need. Today, we can show we stand by our word. Today, we can show that we can come together in the national interest. Today,
Not too much noise in the chamber. The Prime Minister is addressing the House and must be heard. The Prime Minister.
Today, we can show we can come together in the national interest. Today, we can take a step forward together. This is a difficult day for members right across the House. I'm asking members to take a hard decision, and I know that. I'm asking some honourable members. Now I'll give them
In her heart of hearts, won't she accept that this Brexit will make Britain poorer, weaker, more divided and more isolated? And the door she should not shut is the door of democracy. She should allow the people to have the final say if they want this shambles, because the Leavers in my area certainly don't.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the honourable gentleman, as I've said to the House before, if he looks at the economic analysis and he looks at the different types of Brexit that could take place, he will see that the deal that delivers on the result of the referendum and has the best economic outcome for this country is the deal the government has put forward. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I know that this is a difficult day for members right across the House. I'm asking them to take a hard decision, and I know that. I'm asking some honourable members to vote for a Brexit that is less than they hoped for, and that's not easy. I'm asking other honourable members on the opposition benches to help me deliver on the instruction of the British people, and that's not easy either. There are good Labour members opposite who are as determined as I am to deliver the Brexit that their constituents voted for. As willing as I am to make a compromise in order to move our country forward. And at this historic moment for our country, it is right to put aside self and party, right to accept It is right to accept the responsibility given to us by the British people, and that is what I have done, Mr. Speaker. That is what I have done, Mr. Speaker. I have said I am prepared to leave this job earlier than I intended.
Order! Our proceedings are being widely watched. Please let's treat each other with respect. The Prime Minister is winding up the debate and must be heard. The Prime Minister.
I have said that I am prepared to leave this job earlier than I intended to secure the right outcome for our country. And when the division bell rings in a few moments' time, every one of us will have to look into our hearts and decide what is best for our constituents and our country. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way, and she's right to say that she has sacrificed her own position to try and get her deal through.
Shame.
But does she appreciate that in doing so, she is asking us to place our trust in who will follow her? And looking at the likely candidates, I've got to say sincerely to her, she may have sacrificed her career to put the country first, but there are plenty of people who aim to follow her who've always put themselves first above the country.
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman, the numbers in this House will not change. The numbers across this House will be the same. The desire of this House to be able to have a greater role in the future will not change. I've made the commitment that I have in relation to the legislation in the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, in relation to the amendment from the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent Central. This, in the next stage, it will be important that there is a greater involvement of Parliament to be able to ensure that as we move forward together, we get that right result for our country. But this is about our country. It is about our national interest. As I say, everybody will have to... I'll give way one last time. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank the Prime Minister for giving way. The Prime Minister said this is about the country. But with respect, Prime Minister, that is not how it's seen. Brexit, withdrawal agreement, referendum has always been about the Conservative Party and its
This House, across all parties, voted for a referendum. This House, across all parties, voted to trigger Article 50. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I forget, of course, that the Scottish National Party always have a different view on this because they want to stay in the EU, they want to stay in the Common Agricultural Policy, they want to stay in the Common Fisheries Policy. No good for Scottish fishermen and Scottish farmers. I had said I would give one last time, but as I've just referenced the SNP, I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Well, it's some way to build compromise, Mr. Speaker, but why did she never come forward to the Scottish Government and the Scottish National Party, offer wide sweeping reforms and devolution for employment law on welfare, for example, in order to give Scotland the power it needs to protect itself from the measures in her deal that it doesn't like? Instead, she stuck her head in the sand, and that's why she's got nowhere with the Scottish Government or the Scottish National Party.
To the honourable gentleman, the Government has given the Scottish Government extra powers, and they're not using them. Oh, except, of course, the power to increase taxes in Scotland for the United Kingdom. So I say to members this: if you want to deliver Brexit, this is the moment. If you're passionate about making sure that the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, back this motion. If you care about our union and want a deal that protects it, back the motion. If you want to honour the referendum but want Parliament to shape our future relationship, back this motion. It's the right thing for our country, it's the right thing for our constituents, and with all my heart I commend this motion to the House.
1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 The question is as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. No! Division! Clear the lobby! Order. The question is as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Andrew Stevenson and Craig Whittaker. Tellers for the noes, Thangham Debonair and Nick Dakin. Lock the doors! Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 286. The noes to the left, 344.
The ayes to the right, 286. The noes to the left, 344. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock! Point of order. The Prime Minister.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it should be a matter of profound regret to every member of this House that once again we have been unable to support leaving the European Union in an orderly fashion. The implications of the House's decision are grave. The legal default now is that the United Kingdom is due to leave the European Union on the 12th of April, in just 14 days' time. That is not enough time to agree, legislate for and ratify a deal, and yet the House has been clear it will not permit leaving without a deal. And so we will have to agree an alternative way forward. The European Union has been clear that any further extension will need to have a clear purpose and will need to be agreed unanimously by the heads of the other 27 member states ahead of the 12th of April. It is almost certain to involve the United Kingdom being required to hold European parliamentary elections. On Monday, this House will continue the process to see if there is a stable majority for a particular alternative version of our future relationship with the EU. Of course, all of the options will require the withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, I fear we are reaching the limits of this process in this House. This House has rejected no deal. It has rejected no Brexit. On Wednesday, it rejected all the variations of the deal on the table. And today, it has rejected approving the withdrawal agreement alone and continuing a process on the future. This government will continue to press the case for the orderly Brexit that the result of the referendum demands.
Point of order, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, this is now the third time the Prime Minister's deal has been rejected. When he was defeated the first time, the Prime Minister said it's clear this House does not support the deal. Does she now finally accept that the House does not support the deal? Because she seemed to indicate just now that she's going to return to this issue again. On Monday, this House has the chance, and I say to all members, Mr. Speaker, the responsibility to find a majority for a better deal for all the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, the House has been clear. This deal now has to change. There has to be an alternative found. And if the Prime Minister can't accept that, then she must go, not at an indeterminate date in the future, but now, so that we can decide the future of this country through a general election.
Point of order, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We should all be aware.
Order, the right honourable gentleman must be heard. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We should all be aware of the responsibilities that we all have in this House, the seriousness of the situation that we are in. And I would say respectfully to the Prime Minister, she now has to accept that her deal has been defeated 3 times. And I applaud the members of Parliament on all sides that voted against the government's proposition. It is a bad deal, and we have to find a way out of the crisis that we are in. All of our constituents would expect that. We must give ourselves time, and I suggest to the Prime Minister we now must look seriously at the option of revocation. We need to apply the handbrake to this process. And quite simply, Mr. Speaker,
You've messed it up.
The Prime Minister has failed to take this deal forward. She does not have the confidence of the House. The Prime Minister has indicated her departure. She should now go, and we should be having a general election.
Thank you. Yes, I'll come to the honourable lady. Point of order, Sir Vincent Cable.
On Monday, it is perfectly possible that the House may indicate a preference for one of the options such as a customs union or a confirmatory vote, which are, of course, compatible with the withdrawal agreement. If that is the case, is the Prime Minister then open to listening to the view of the House and considering how we might have a longer extension to explore them?
I think the question was perhaps to some degree a rhetorical inquiry. The Right Honourable Gentleman has made his point, but further debate on these important matters will follow next week, and we'll leave it there. Point of order, Heidi Allen.
The Prime Minister must now seriously recognise this deal is over. And this House has a responsibility, a serious responsibility on Monday to find a solution to this impasse. There are jobs and livelihoods right across this country at stake now. The way out of this impasse, as many of us have been saying for months and months and months, we must have a people's vote now.
Point of order. Yes, I will come to the Honourable Lady first, because I saw her first. Point of order, Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, it does beg a belief that the Prime Minister still seems to not recognise a dead deal when there's one right in front of her. It has now been defeated 3 times, and that is in spite of the procedural games that have been played. And does she realise just how grotesque it looked when, frankly, she was looking as if she was willing to sell out the country's future for the price of some Tory MP careers in replacement for it? The idea that it was somehow sensible for MPs on the other side to say that they would suddenly change their minds about a deal they've been against for months because they thought they might have some career advantage from it. That is wrong, and it is contemptuous of this country.
But there is a degree of latitude on these occasions, but the Honourable Lady has stretched it excessively. If she'd wanted to speak in the debate, she might well have caught my eye, but she didn't seek to do so. Point of order, Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, could I urge the Prime Minister now to look seriously at what the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Esher and Walton, said earlier in the course of the debate about the backstop issue? She knows that remains the problem. She knows that Michel Barnier and Leo Varadkar this week have said that in a no-deal scenario there will be no hard border. Please, Prime Minister, even now, as the Right Honourable Gentleman said earlier, use the time constructively to get that matter sorted out.
Thank you. Order. I invite the whip on duty to move the agenda.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. And then the other going to say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound.